In the early hours of December 8, 1941, as the sun was still hours away from breaking over the Philippine Sea, a young sailor aboard the USS Sea Lion stood in the control room of his submarine and heard something that would change everything. The sonar operator, hunched over his equipment in the dim green glow of his instruments, detected an echo. Not the distant ping of whale song or the rumble of distant shipping lanes, something closer, something metallic and purposeful. And somewhere in that moment, between the operator's breath and the next sweep of the sonar beam, the first American submarine of the Pacific War learned that it was under attack, though it would not survive long enough to fight back. But that story, like so many from the depths of World War II, would take time to unfold. For now, imagine instead the seconds before such knowledge arrives. Imagine the Pacific Ocean on a moonless night, stretching endlessly in every direction, a vast darkness punctuated only by the faint phosphorescence of disturbed water. The waves above are invisible in the blackness, but you would feel them if you were there, a gentle roll transmitted through hull and bone. The ocean at midnight is vast and patient and utterly indifferent to the men who choose to descend into it. Below that surface, at perhaps 200 feet, in the absolute darkness where no light has ever naturally reached, a submarine rests in what submariners called the silent routine. The engines have been cut. The diesel motors that powered the boat on the surface are sealed away, their exhaust vented and their fuel lines shut. Now only the electric motors hum, a low, almost musical vibration that runs through the steel like a heartbeat. The lighting inside is minimal. Every incandescent bulb has been dimmed to preserve battery power, and more importantly, to preserve the crew's night vision, in case they had to surface quickly, in case they had to see danger coming across black water. Human eyes that had adjusted to the submarine's twilight would have moments of advantage. It was a small thing. Everything underwater was a small thing, balanced against something larger. The control room, where most of the critical machinery of a submarine gathered, was never more than 12 feet across and perhaps 18 feet long. In that narrow space, 3 or 4 men would typically be standing watch. The helmsman sat at the wheel, his hands light on the control yoke that governed the diving planes, those adjustable fins that kept the boat level and stable at depth. Beside him, the plainsman monitored the depth gauges, watching the needles that told him whether they were ascending or descending. Even in stillness, even in perfect equilibrium, those needles could drift. The ocean pushed, always pushed, and the submarine had to push back. Above the helmsman's head, a series of small lights indicated the status of critical systems. The periscope was stowed. The torpedo tube doors were closed. The ballast tanks, those ingenious spaces that allowed the boat to sink and rise at will, held a precise balance of seawater and compressed air. Change that balance by mere pounds, and the submarine would drift up or down. Every system was interconnected. Every gauge was watched. Every man's attention was part of a vast web of awareness that kept the boat and the men inside it alive. And then there was the sonar man. He sat at his console, wearing headphones that sealed out the ambient sounds of the submarine itself, focusing only on what his equipment could hear through the water. The ping of active sonar was rarely used by submarines, for it announced their presence to any listening craft nearby. Instead, they used passive sonar, listening, always listening. The ocean was full of sound, though most of it was inaudible to human ears. Shrimp clicking, whales singing in frequencies too low to hear, the distant rumble of ship engines carrying for miles through the conducting medium of water, and beneath it all, sometimes, the subtle whisper of another submarine moving through the darkness. A sonar operator in World War II was part acoustic technician, part mystic. He interpreted patterns of sound that had no visible origin. He listened for the specific signature of Japanese destroyer propellers, or merchant ships, or other submarines. He knew the particular throb of a diesel engine and the electric whine of an electric motor. He could sometimes distinguish between the acoustic signatures of different ship classes. In the quiet darkness of a submarine running silent, the sonar operator was the eyes of the boat. He was the first to know what was coming. The rest of the crew, and a fleet submarine carried between 60 and 80 men, were distributed throughout the vessel. The engine room was aft, a tight compartment filled with enormous electric motors that were themselves silent compared to the diesel engine's topside. The maneuvering room, just forward, was where electricians monitored the battery status and controlled the distribution of electrical power. Further forward still lay the torpedo room, where 8 sleek weapons rested in their tubes or lay secured in racks along the walls. Forward of that, below the control room, was the crew's quarters, bunks stacked 3 high in the limited space, many of them no more than 6 feet long and barely 2 feet wide. Men slept in 8-hour rotations, and you slept in the bunk of whichever sailor had just ended his watch. The warmth was still in the mattress. The pillow still held the indent of another man's head. The galley was small, barely larger than a closet, but it was the heart of the submarine's social life during long patrols. The cooks who worked there were treasured men. They had access to the storage spaces, and they could create small luxuries that made the monotony of patrol more bearable. A batch of cookies, coffee that was slightly warmer or slightly stronger than regulations technically allowed. In the confined darkness of a submarine, small kindnesses and small comforts took on enormous significance. And forward of everything, in the very bow of the submarine, in the nose section that felt the water first as the boat moved through the ocean, lay more torpedoes. The smell of oil and metal was everywhere, mingling with the smell of diesel fuel, human sweat, and the particular staleness that accumulated in air that had been recycled through ventilation systems for weeks at a time. There was no escape from these smells. They became part of you. After a patrol of 60 or 70 days, submariners would sometimes report that they could not smell anything at all, their senses numbed by the absolute constancy of the environment. Now, as the hours of that night in the Pacific deepened, the submarine waited in the silence it maintained. This was the routine that would be repeated thousands of times during the war. Dive, move slowly, listen, surface at night to recharge batteries, dive again with dawn, move, listen, wait. Every patrol was a combination of desperate boredom and sudden terror. The monotony could last for weeks, seeing nothing, hearing nothing but the sea. And then, in an instant, everything could change. If you have ever wondered about the unseen battles of World War II, the submarines that sank enemy ships from the depths, yes, but more than that, the American submarines that vanished into that darkness and never returned, then you might want to subscribe to this channel for the full depths of these stories. We'll be exploring the complete history of America's submarine disasters, the boats that never came home, the technical failures and the tactical decisions that cost lives, and the slow process of historical recovery that decades later brought closure to the families and the Navy. The deep waters hold many secrets, and we'll be descending into them together at a pace that honors both the history and the silence. But for now, in this darkness, in this quiet moment before the war intrudes, let yourself imagine what it was like to be in that control room, the soft hum of the electric motors, the gentle breathing of the men standing watch, the occasional creak of the hull as water pressure adjusted. A submarine running silent at depth was one of the most isolated environments a human being could inhabit. You were in a world without light, without sky, without any horizon except the ones that existed in your mind. The surface of the ocean, just 200 feet above, might as well have been 200 miles away. You were truly alone, surrounded by 95 other men. The engineers and designers who built these submarines in the 1930s and early 1940s had created vessels that represented the cutting edge of American naval technology. Welded steel hulls that could withstand the crushing pressure of deep water. Diesel engines powerful enough to move an 800-ton vessel through the ocean at 12 knots or more. Torpedo tubes with mechanisms so precise that they had to be, because a failed launch in the presence of an enemy could be fatal. Battery systems so advanced for their time that they powered electric motors that were quieter than any surface ship could hope to achieve. But all of this technology, all of this ingenuity, was only as reliable as the men who operated it, and only as safe as the depth of water below the hull. The ocean, for all its apparent openness on the surface, was a fundamentally confining place for a submarine. You could not go deeper than the pressure hull would allow. Most fleet submarines operated between 150 and 400 feet. Go deeper, and the metal itself would begin to fail. You could hear the groaning of the hull under stress, a sound that submariners reported was difficult to hear without a certain amount of existential anxiety. The steel was trying to crush you, the water was trying to crush you, and you were trying to stay alive inside a tube of metal that was deliberately held rigid against forces that wanted nothing more than to fold it like paper. These were the machines and the men that America sent out in the months after Pearl Harbor to strike back at Japan. And while many of these submarines would become legends, their captains celebrated, their patrols recounted in official histories, there were others that vanished with barely a record. Boats that were lost to causes that remained unknown for decades. Submarines that may have been sunk by equipment failures, or by accidents, or by enemy action, but which simply disappeared beneath the waves and sent no signal, left no wreckage that could be easily found, and took their secrets with them into the depths. The question that haunted the Navy in the early years of the war was simple. Where were these boats? Why were some patrols never reported as completed? Why did some submarines depart for their assigned areas and simply never return? In an age before wireless communication was as reliable as it would later become, before technology could track every vessel with precision, the loss of a submarine was often not discovered until long after the fact, and sometimes not discovered at all until many years had passed and researchers began searching. If you find yourself drawn to these stories, the untold narratives of steel hulls sliding beneath darkened waves, of crews who vanished into the deep with their secrets intact, of the machinery that became both their only hope and their instrument of fate, then consider subscribing to this channel, where we explore the complete and unfolding history of America's submarine service, with the kind of patient attention these lost boats deserve. Each episode unfolds another thread from the underwater war, another boat, another crew, and the slow archaeological work of historians and families piecing together what really happened in those final, silent moments before a submarine failed to surface. The stories don't end with the war. They continue in archives, in newly discovered wreck sites, in the voices of survivors now in their 90s and beyond, in the descendants of men who never made it home. We'll move together through the decades, from the experimental, cramped boats of the peacetime Navy through the desperate early months of Pacific combat, through the grinding, invisible campaigns that cost the lives of thousands in pursuit of Japanese supply lines and warships. We'll meet the captains whose names became legends, aggressive, brilliant men who pressed deeper into enemy waters than anyone thought possible. We'll examine the weapons that sometimes betrayed them, the protocols that couldn't account for chaos, the radio signals that went unanswered. And we'll honor the maintenance men, the radio men, the torpedo specialists, the engineering officers deep in the machinery spaces who kept these boats alive as long as they could, often in conditions that seem impossible to imagine now, stuffed into passages so narrow that two men could barely pass each other, working in heat and oil and the constant background hum of diesel engines and batteries. knowing that a single error in depth control, a single malfunctioning fitting, a single miscalculation by a commanding officer could crush them all in seconds under tons of seawater. This is the story of the boats that never came home, and of the cost paid in the silent service, a cost measured not in headlines or official ceremonies, but in empty chairs at dinner tables, in children who never knew their fathers, in the long work of remembrance that continues even now, more than 80 years after the last torpedo was fired in that war. By subscribing, you'll journey with us through each loss, each mystery, each moment of courage and confusion, as we piece together the fragmentary record of what happened below the surface, where the darkness was absolute and the only witnesses were the fish and the crushing weight of the ocean itself. The submarine force that America possessed in the 1930s was not yet the formidable weapon it would become. It was instead a service searching for itself, a collection of experimental vessels and their crews, learning as they went, discovering what lay beneath the waves through trial and error, and a kind of patient, methodical curiosity that defined those quieter years before the storm. The boats themselves were strange contraptions by modern standards, built one or two at a time, each one slightly different from the last, as if the Navy was asking itself at every turn, what if we tried this? What if we added that? Some of these submarines were barely larger than a destroyer escort, their hulls groaning under pressures that seemed almost impossible, their compartments so narrow that a man could touch both walls if he stretched his arms across the width of the passageway. Consider the S-class boats that had been built in the 1920s and early 30s, some of which still served even as the later, larger fleet boats were sliding down the ways into the Atlantic and Pacific. These were teaching vessels in many ways, platforms for learning, cramped beyond measure, with crews of 50 or 60 men living in spaces so confined that privacy became an almost unimaginable luxury. A sailor might have a bunk that folded into the wall, a footlocker beneath it, and perhaps 8 inches of clearance above his face when he lay down. The air grew thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of diesel oil, of unwashed bodies in the summer heat, of cooking that could never quite be fresh because supplies lasted only weeks at sea. This was the world into which young men descended willingly, driven by a sense of duty, or adventure, or both, learning to navigate a vertical iron tube filled with machinery and instruments they barely understood. The doctrine being written in those pre-war years was something less than clear. The Navy did not know quite what submarines were for. Were they defensive weapons, meant to guard the coastline? Were they scouts and reconnaissance platforms? Or could they perhaps become the commerce raiders that Germany had used in the Great War? The Japanese were asking themselves the same questions, building larger boats with longer range, designing submarines that might hunt across an entire ocean. American officers studied these developments with careful attention, reading reports and analyzing the capabilities of foreign boats, trying to anticipate what the next conflict might require. Some believed submarines would be most valuable in fleet battles, working alongside battleships and cruisers. Others thought they might be suited only to patrol work, to warning of enemy approach. Few, if any, imagined in the peaceful years of 1938 and 1939 that submarines would become the primary weapon of undersea war, that they would roam the Pacific almost unopposed for months at a time, sinking merchant vessels and warships alike, changing the very nature of naval combat. The men who commanded these experimental boats were drawn from the Navy's established officer corps, many of them graduates of Annapolis, men trained in the traditions of surface warfare, who now found themselves navigating an entirely different kind of conflict. They had to learn how to operate in 3 dimensions instead of 2, how to think in terms of depth and darkness and pressure, how to make decisions without seeing their targets, relying instead on instruments and the reports of their officers and enlisted men. The training was rigorous and demanding. New skippers would make trial runs with experienced captains observing, watching how they handled the boat in different sea states, how they managed the constant balance between staying hidden and positioning themselves for an attack. There was a certain tension always present in that era, a recognition that they were pioneering something, that mistakes could be fatal, that the ocean had no forgiveness for the careless or the ignorant. The submarines themselves were works of industrial ingenuity, built in ways that seem almost quaint from our modern perspective. Welders worked seam by seam along the pressure hulls, fusing steel plates together with painstaking care, knowing that a single weak point could mean the death of everyone aboard when the boat dove beyond certain depths. The diving planes, horizontal fins that controlled the submarine's angle and depth, had to be adjusted constantly by men who read depth gauges and performed calculations on paper, an intricate dance of precision and feel. The torpedo tubes, those narrow metal cylinders running through the boat, had to be loaded and unloaded by hand, a task that required both strength and delicate attention because a torpedo was far from a simple projectile. It was a machine unto itself, with its own engine, its own guidance system, its own potential for betrayal or catastrophe. Life aboard these pre-war boats had a rhythm to it, a carefully structured routine designed to maintain discipline and efficiency in an environment where either could deteriorate with surprising speed. Men stood watches in 4-hour shifts, rotating through every station, learning the boat from bow to stern. The engine room was a kingdom unto itself, where diesel engineers tended to the massive engines that had to be kept running with absolute reliability, because an engine failure at depth could trap the submarine in darkness and pressure it was never designed to withstand. The control room was the heart of the boat, where the commanding officer and his officers maintained awareness of the boat's attitude and depth, where the crucial decisions were made in the compressed moments when danger suddenly emerged. The torpedo room forward and the after torpedo room aft were staffed by men who slept in racks, stacked 3 high, squeezed into spaces barely larger than coffins, living with the constant awareness that they shared their compartment with weapons designed to kill. How did men adapt to such conditions? Some discovered that they possessed a natural comfort with confinement, that the familiar metal walls became almost protective, that the rhythm of the boat's operation soothed rather than troubled them. Others struggled continuously with claustrophobia, with the weight of the ocean above, with the knowledge that there was only one way in and one way out, and if something went wrong, there might be no escape at all. The Navy recognized this and tried to screen candidates carefully, looking for men with psychological stability, with patience, with a kind of quiet determination. Yet there was also an element of selection that happened naturally. Those who could not adapt left the service or were reassigned, while those who could adapt remained, developing over months and years a kind of intimate familiarity with their boats that bordered on the mystical. The submarine force of the 1930s was small, perhaps a few thousand men altogether distributed among perhaps 100 boats in various states of readiness and repair. Surface warfare still held the prestige, the visible heroism of battles fought in daylight, under open sky. Submarine service was something different, something quieter, less celebrated, less understood by the civilian population who read about their navy in newspapers and magazines. The men who chose this path did so with an acceptance that their work would likely never be celebrated, that their names would probably never become famous, that they would perform their duties in darkness and silence, and return to their ports without fanfare. This acceptance was itself a kind of character, a dedication to service for its own sake, rather than for recognition or reward. As the 1930s drew toward a close, there were signs that this era of peaceful experimentation was ending. The international situation darkened with each passing year. Germany rearmed under Hitler, Japan expanded into China, Italy invaded Ethiopia, and the submarine force, still small, still learning, still operating with doctrine that was not fully formed, began to prepare itself for a conflict that would test every lesson it had learned and demand that it learn 1,000 more. The boats that had seemed so experimental, so strange and untested, would soon become the front line of American naval power in the Pacific. The men who had struggled to survive in cramped compartments, who had sweated through training exercises and trial runs, would find themselves engaged in actual warfare, facing real enemies, making decisions that would mean the difference between life and death for themselves and their crews. The world beneath the waves was about to change forever, and the American submarine force, unprepared though it was, would be at the center of that transformation. On the morning of December 7, 1941, the harbor at Pearl lay still in the early light, and then it did not. The Japanese strike came in waves across the pale sky, and in those hours, the calculus of the Pacific War shifted irreversibly. The battleships that Americans had trusted would anchor their naval power settled into the mud. The Arizona, the Oklahoma, the West Virginia, and with them sank a certain kind of faith. When the smoke cleared and the numbness began to lift, the Navy found itself facing an impossible question. What weapon remained to strike back? The battleships were gone. The aircraft carriers had been elsewhere, at sea, and they could not be everywhere at once. But in the submarine berths, something else was waiting. The boats, the long, grey, quietly purposeful vessels that had spent the peacetime years running drills in the Pacific, learning their trade in the slow, methodical way of the undersea service. These boats were still whole. These boats could move, and perhaps most importantly, these boats could hunt. The decision to deploy submarines on offensive operations came almost at once, with an urgency that reflected both desperation and practicality. Within days of Pearl Harbor, American submarines were being ordered west toward the Japanese-held territories of the Pacific. They were not sent with illusions of instant victory. Rather, they were sent because they were what remained available, and because a nation at war cannot afford to wait. The submarine force, for decades regarded as something of a specialized and somewhat mysterious branch of the Navy, suddenly found itself thrust into a role for which it would become, in the eyes of many, America's first and sometimes only reliable weapon of retaliation. The strategic logic was sound, though it would take years to fully unfold. Japan's island empire stretched across vast distances, connected by supply lines that ran by ship. Those ships carried food, fuel, ammunition, and all the sinews of an industrial war effort. To interdict those ships, to sink them in the dark waters between the conquering armies and their sources of supply, was to slowly, methodically strangle the Japanese war machine from within. This was not the glamorous naval battle that captains trained for, the clash of great battle fleets in daylight. This was something quieter, slower, and in its way far more relentless. The submarine captains who sailed west in those first desperate months after Pearl Harbor carried their orders into waters they had never encountered in wartime. The waters around the Philippines, the South China Sea, the approaches to the home islands of Japan itself. These were no longer waters to transit carefully or chart with academic precision. They were hunting grounds now, and the hunters were American. Some of what they would face they could anticipate. Japanese destroyers and patrol craft, anti-submarine vessels small and quick and dangerous, Japanese aircraft dropping depth charges from the sky with increasing accuracy as the months wore on. But some of what they would encounter came as a shock, a revelation of the gap between what had been imagined in peacetime exercises and what actually awaited in the darkness of active war. The ocean had its own lessons to teach, and they came swiftly. Consider the strange disorientation of those first patrols. Submariners had trained against dummy targets, against theoretical opponents. They had run through drills with mechanical precision. Yet when a submarine captain's periscope broke the surface and revealed an actual Japanese merchant vessel, actual sailors moving about its deck, actual enemy. The moment crystallized into something both utterly abstract and viscerally real. The decision to fire, to kill men they could see but not touch, to send a torpedo toward a ship where they could imagine the terror of the moment of impact. This was a different thing entirely than the exercises had been. The first American submarine patrols of the Pacific War were therefore marked by a peculiar mixture of aggression and uncertainty. Captains were eager to strike, knowing their nation was grieving and burning with the need for response. Yet they also faced mechanical problems, doctrinal questions, and the simple human challenge of killing at a distance, with weapons that did not always behave as expected. Was the torpedo running as it should? Was the enemy truly where the instruments suggested? In the darkness below the waves, where light itself became theoretical, every decision carried weight. The retaliation, when it came, was not dramatic in the way that the Pearl Harbor raid had been dramatic. There were no massive carrier strikes, no sudden concentrations of force in one terrible morning. Instead, the retaliation took the form of a slow, grinding war of attrition. One ship sunk here, another vessel lost there, a supply convoy disrupted, a transport that failed to reach its destination. From the American perspective, these actions were necessary, moral, and urgent. From the Japanese perspective, they became an increasingly serious problem as 1942 wore on. But before the submarines could truly become effective in this role, they would have to learn, and learning in wartime meant learning through loss. It meant sending boats into danger with weapons that did not always work, with tactics that were still being written, with crews that were brave and trained, but not yet experienced in actual combat. Some of those boats would not return. Some of those crews would never come home, and in their loss, they would teach the lessons that other crews could learn from, that other boats could benefit from, as the long undersea war evolved through the remaining years of the conflict. The submarine force in December of 1941 was ready, in the way that trained professionals are ready, competent, disciplined, equipped with the best boats and the best men their nation could provide. But readiness for war and readiness for the specific horrors and challenges that a particular war would present are not quite the same thing. That gap, that space between preparation and reality, would claim its first victims almost immediately. The submarine that emerged from American shipyards in those first years of war was a machine of particular elegance, designed not by poets, but by engineers who understood that elegance and survival were often the same thing underwater. The Gato class, which began rolling off the ways in 1941, represented the synthesis of a decade's accumulated knowledge about what a submarine needed to be. They were, by the standards of their time, remarkably capable boats, 211 feet long, displacing just over 1,400 tons on the surface, lean and purposeful in their lines. And when you stood in the control room of a Gato, which was rarely larger than a modest living room, you understood immediately that every inch of space had been argued over, negotiated, justified in blueprints and meetings that had stretched across countless nights at the design bureaus. The engines that drove them were twin diesel motors, each producing a maximum of 4,000 horsepower when the boat ran on the surface. These were not quiet machines. In the engine room, which occupied much of the aft section of the boat, the roar and vibration of those Fairbanks Morse or General Motors diesels created a world of heat and percussion that somehow men learned to work within, to almost become part of. You could feel those engines through the steel of the hull itself, a constant, almost living presence. And it was here that some of the most skilled enlisted men in the Navy worked their watches, monitoring fuel consumption, checking oil pressure, listening to the particular rhythm and quality of the mechanical heartbeat, with an ear that could detect trouble long before any gauge could register it. The The sound of a diesel engine changing in pitch, even slightly, could mean the difference between returning home and not returning at all. When the boat needed to submerge, when the command came down to go under and hide, the diesels would be shut down and the battery would take over. The Gato carried a massive lead-acid battery, some 252 cells of them, spread across 2 compartments, running almost the entire length of the boat below the main deck. This battery was, in a sense, the submarine's second heartbeat, its silent capability, its greatest gift, and also its greatest constraint. A fully charged battery could drive the boat forward at speeds of 8 knots, or perhaps slightly more, but only for as long as the electricity lasted. The battery defined the underwater endurance. It was why submarines hunted at night, on the surface, when the diesels could recharge the battery and the boat could search for targets in the darkness. And it was why deep, prolonged underwater chases against fast-moving targets so often ended in failure. The battery would simply drain away and the boat would have to surface, to run, to find a new depth, a new angle of attack. The nerve center of all this mechanical complexity was the control room, a space so compressed, so dense with meaning and function, that it was almost dreamlike to stand in it. The periscope shafts rose up through the center, 2 of them, the attack scope, shorter and thinner, and the search scope, taller and more substantial. The captain's station was positioned to make use of both, and the helmsman and plainsman who controlled the boat's angle and direction sat in pairs of small seats, their hands on wheels that controlled the diving planes with a sensitivity that required almost intuitive understanding. One sailor would control the bow planes, another the stern planes, and the boat's ballast, the water taken in to make it sink, was controlled by yet another hand in the background, usually a young man who was learning an obscure but absolutely vital trade. This is what a submarine demanded of its crew. Not just mechanical knowledge, though that was certainly there, but an acceptance of profound constraint, of working in spaces so crowded that privacy was not merely absent, but impossible. 75 or 80 men, living in a steel tube that was never more than 16 feet in diameter, for patrols that lasted anywhere from 6 weeks to 4 months. Where did they sleep? In bunks that were often stacked 3 high, so close to pipes and valves and equipment that you could reach out in darkness and touch them. Where did they eat? In a tiny crew's mess that also served as the torpedo room, where the long steel weapons themselves were stored in their tubes, waiting. Where did they perform the ordinary functions of daily life, the functions that human bodies require? In a single head, a single toilet, shared by 80 men. The very concept seems almost impossible to contemplate in comfort. And yet men did this, month after month, because they were sailors and because this was the war. The weapons that made all this sacrifice worthwhile were the Mark 14 torpedoes, sleek and lethal machines some 21 inches in diameter, packed with over 300 pounds of high explosive warhead. Each Gato carried up to 24 of these weapons, some in tubes along the bow and stern, others stored carefully in the torpedo room, ready to be loaded. The Mark 14 was supposed to run true, to track straight toward its target, to maintain its depth as it traveled through the darkness toward the enemy hull. It was supposed to detonate either on contact or, in a more sophisticated version, when it passed directly beneath the target, using magnetic detonators to trigger a tremendous explosion that would break the keel, the spine of the target ship. These were the promises the torpedo carried, and these weapons represented the entire offensive purpose of the submarine. Every patrol, every risk, every moment of tension in the darkness was ultimately justified only by the moment when these weapons could be released and sent forward toward enemy ships. And yet, throughout this period, from 1941 into 1942 and beyond, the weapons themselves were often faulty, and few men aboard the submarines knew exactly how faulty they were. The captains, the experienced skippers, would suspect something was wrong when their torpedoes failed to detonate, when they would see the telltale miss of a weapon passing harmlessly beneath a target, or a strike that produced no explosion, no catastrophic eruption of light and heat. But the early reports were confused, the feedback was incomplete, and the torpedo shops and ordnance experts ashore were slow to believe that their weapons that had been designed with such precision, with such theoretical understanding of the physics involved, could possibly be unreliable. This disconnect, this lag between the reality of what was happening underwater and the understanding of the men who designed the weapons, would cost American submarines precious opportunities, and it would cost the lives of men who did everything right and still came home with empty racks and stories of mysterious failures. But that too was part of the submarine's particular burden. Unlike a surface ship, which could not escape the consequences of a defective weapon, a submarine bore the weight of that failure, carried it through the darkness, and had to live with the knowledge that the torpedo had been fired, the window of opportunity had closed, and the enemy had escaped. The boat would have to reload, retreat, find another target, another chance. This patience, this acceptance of delay and difficulty, and the fundamental unpredictability of warfare, was written into the very DNA of submarine operations. And the men who served in these boats, the officers fresh from the Naval Academy or carefully selected from the enlisted ranks, the engineers and the torpedo men and the radio men and all the others, these men learned to live with that uncertainty the way submarines themselves learned to move through the darkness, with patience, with attention, with an almost meditative acceptance of what the sea would bring. In the opening weeks of December 1941, while the shock of Pearl Harbor still vibrated through the American consciousness, there was another naval installation in the Pacific that would experience its own devastation, one that received far less attention from the newspapers, but would mark a profound turning point in the submarine service. This was Cavite Navy Yard, situated on the island of Luzon in the Philippines, a facility that had served as the heart of American submarine operations in the Far East, where repair facilities hummed with activity and men worked on the very boats that would soon become instruments of retaliation. The yard itself was a sprawling collection of machine shops, dry docks, warehouses, and berthing areas, all organized within a peninsula that jutted into Manila Bay, and it was here that one of America's newer submarines, the USS Sea Lion, lay undergoing maintenance and repairs. The Sea Lion was a Sargo-class submarine, built just 4 years earlier and commissioned in 1939, a boat that represented the evolution of American submarine design, as the nation's naval architects were learning by trial and error what worked best beneath the waves. She displaced about 1,800 tons when submerged, carried a crew of around 50 men, and was considered a capable vessel for her time, though submarines, then as now, were experimental platforms where no two patrols were ever quite identical in terms of equipment or tactics. The boat had arrived in Manila just weeks before the attack on Pearl Harbor, joining the Asiatic Fleet's submarine squadron, and her crew, many of them seasoned men who had trained in peacetime routines, suddenly found themselves living with the knowledge that war was no longer theoretical but imminent. On the morning of December 10, 1941, just 2 days after Pearl Harbor, Japanese aircraft descended upon Cavite in waves, their intention clear and their execution methodical. The attack was not a mere reconnaissance pass or a single bombing run, but a sustained assault that lasted hours, and the submarine base became a conflagration of explosions, fire, and smoke. Can you imagine being a submariner at that moment, standing or working aboard your boat, while wave after wave of enemy aircraft screamed through the sky above you, knowing that the metal hull that usually offered protection underground was now sitting exposed in a shipyard, vulnerable in a way that no submarine was ever meant to be. The USS Sea Lion, in her berth at Cavite, took direct hits from falling bombs. The explosions tore through her pressure hull, the compartments that were designed to withstand the crushing force of ocean depths, now shattered by the force of ordnance falling from the sky. Fire spread rapidly through her interior, and the men aboard, some of whom survived the initial blasts, realized with horrifying certainty that their boat was lost. The crew made a desperate effort to save their ship, fighting the flames, attempting to limit the spread of damage, but the intensity of the bombardment and the accumulated damage to her hull made it clear within minutes that the Sea Lion could not be saved. Orders came down to abandon ship, and the men who had trained to operate one of America's most advanced warships scrambled off the boat and into the chaos of the burning yard. The destruction at Cavite that day was catastrophic, not only for the Sea Lion, but for the entire American submarine presence in the Philippines. Ships burned, buildings collapsed, and among the rubble lay the first American submarine to be lost to the enemy in World War II. She did not go down in combat against a Japanese warship, did not take enemy lives as she sank, did not achieve any of the objectives that submarines were designed to accomplish. Instead, she was destroyed while defenseless, caught in a moment when America's military power in the Far East was being shattered by an enemy that had achieved tactical surprise across an entire ocean. The loss of the USS Sea Lion was a profound psychological blow to the submarine force, though perhaps not in the way one might expect. Rather than demoralizing the submariners, the destruction of their boat while it lay helpless seemed to crystallize a grim determination among the men who survived. The Sea Lion's loss was a reminder of what was at stake, of how quickly fortune could turn in warfare, and of how the comfortable peacetime routines and experimental protocols of the pre-war years were now swept away in the urgency of actual combat. The men who had served aboard her would scatter to other boats, carrying their experience and their loss with them, becoming part of a submarine service that was learning, even as its first boat went to the bottom, how to fight a total war against a determined enemy. The yard itself was abandoned shortly after the attack, as American forces in the Philippines realized that the Japanese advance was overwhelming and that holding the islands was no longer possible. Cavite, once a symbol of American naval power in Asia, was left behind as the remnants of the fleet retreated southward. The USS Sea Lion, settled in the wreckage of her berth, became a silent monument to the first chapter of America's submarine war, a boat that never fired her torpedoes in anger, never pursued an enemy through the depths, but nonetheless became the first casualty of a conflict that would ultimately claim dozens of her sister ships. The smoke that rose from Cavite on that December morning, obscuring the death of the Sea Lion beneath layers of ash and fire, seemed to mark the beginning of something dark and costly, though no one yet understood just how many boats and how many thousands of men would follow her into the abyss before this war was won. In those first weeks after Pearl Harbor, when the Pacific Fleet lay crippled and America's rage burned white-hot, the submarines began their patrols with incomplete charts and incomplete knowledge of what they would face. The USS Shark, a Sargo-class boat under the command of Lieutenant Commander Eugene Fluckey, slipped away from Brisbane on her third war patrol in February of 1942, carrying not only her crew of 80 men, but the weight of desperate expectation that had fallen upon every submarine captain. She was to hunt near the Philippine Islands, where Japanese transports still moved with something approaching safety, still believing themselves invulnerable in those crowded waters. No one who watched her depart knew that this would be the last time her command would surface in friendly waters. No one could have known. What we know now comes in fragments, pieced together from incomplete records, from the memories of sailors on nearby boats, from the slow archaeology of naval research that took decades to yield its answers. The USS Shark apparently encountered enemy forces somewhere in the waters north of the Philippines, perhaps near Luzon Strait, in mid-February. Whether she was attacked by a Japanese patrol craft, whether she struck an uncharted reef, whether some other catastrophe found her in those treacherous depths, the record does not clearly say. For years afterward, her loss was attributed to different causes by different sources, and confusion reigned in the halls of Naval Command about what had actually happened and when. This was the fog that settled over the submarine service in those opening months, a fog composed partly of distance, partly of the chaos of a newly mobilized war effort, and partly of the simple fact that boats operating in enemy waters sometimes vanished without witnesses, without explanation, without the courtesy of a clear historical record. And then, scarcely weeks after Shark disappeared, there came the loss of the USS Perch, another moment of confusion, another boat that slipped away into shadow. The Perch, a Porpoise-class submarine, was old by submarine standards, commissioned in 1936, already showing the wear and mechanical temperament of a boat that had been pushed through the beginning of the war at a relentless pace. Under the command of Lieutenant Commander David Smith, she had already completed 2 patrols and survived them. On her third, she set out in early March 1942 to hunt in the waters around the East Indies, the vast, shallow archipelago where the Japanese had begun their empire-building drive. It was difficult territory for submarines, cramped with islands, teeming with enemy shipping, and equally teeming with Japanese vessels of war. On March 27th, the Perch encountered a Japanese aircraft, one of the countless eyes the enemy had scattered across those waters. The encounter that followed was a cascade of damage and then a cascade of bad luck that would prove relentless. The aircraft's bombs found their marks, striking the submarine's hull, breaching her pressure hull, filling her interior spaces with seawater that no amount of frantic pumping could overcome. David Smith made the decision that no submarine captain wanted to make, the decision to scuttle, to run his boat ashore on the island of Bawean and destroy her rather than let her fall intact into Japanese hands. The crew was ordered to abandon ship, and 43 of them made their way to the beach, while others, perhaps hoping to slip away undetected, attempted to hide among the island's sparse vegetation. But here the story becomes a meditation on what happens to men when chaos and uncertainty overtake the careful procedures of war. Some of the crew reached Australian territory and returned to the Navy. Others were captured. One of the peculiar agonies of those opening months of the Pacific War was that incomplete information traveled along the same slow channels as orders and intelligence reports, and the truth about what had happened to these boats lagged far behind the moment of their loss. It took time for the full picture of Perch's destruction to reach naval headquarters. It took longer still for anyone to be certain about Shark's fate. In naval records and in official accounts, the losses were sometimes listed with uncertain dates, with provisional causes, with gaps that could only be filled by later research or not filled at all. One captain was presumed lost. Another was known to have survived capture, but his ultimate fate was unclear for months. The submarine's wives and parents received telegrams that said the boats were missing, were overdue, were presumed lost. Each word chosen with careful gravity, but none of them the same as truth. How many weeks passed before some families truly understood that their men would not return? How does one move from hope to certainty when the Navy itself cannot seem to decide? This fog of uncertainty became a defining feature of the submarine war's beginning. Men served in silence, died in silence, and sometimes their deaths themselves remained silent, unconfirmed, disputed, lost in the gaps between what was known and what would later be discovered. The submarine service was learning, in real time, what it meant to wage war in an environment where nothing could be directly observed by those who needed to understand it. A captain filing a report about an encounter hundreds of miles away could describe only what his instruments had told him and what his intuition suspected. A convoy reported sunk might actually have survived. A boat reported sunk might still be conducting operations with a disabled radio. Mothers and wives received no closure because there was, genuinely, no clear moment at which certainty could be achieved. The USS Shark and the USS Perch thus entered the role of boats that never came home, carrying with them all the uncertainty of those opening months, all the incomplete knowledge, all the fog that took years to clear. They became the second and third boats lost in a war that would ultimately claim far more than either number can suggest. And yet their losses, their stories, their confused trajectories through the waters of the Pacific also began to teach the submarine service hard lessons about what worked and what did not work, about the weapons they carried and the tactics they employed, about the terrible vulnerability of submarines that everyone somehow had always known but never fully reckoned until they began to sink. Now, as those early patrols ventured deeper into enemy waters, the men aboard these submarines faced an adversary far more insidious than Japanese destroyers or diving aircraft. It was a problem that lived in the torpedo room itself, silent and faithless, waiting in the darkness of the steel cylinders stacked along the hull. The Mark 14 torpedo, the weapon upon which the entire undersea offensive would depend, carried within it a cascade of defects that would remain hidden for far too long, and the cost would be measured in missed opportunities, in ships that should have sunk but sailed on, and in the quiet rage of captains who knew something was terribly wrong. In the months after Pearl Harbor, submarine commanders were sending reports back to Pearl Harbor and to the Bureau of Ordnance with increasing urgency. A captain would line up a heavy Japanese cruiser in his periscope, would maneuver his boat into perfect firing position at a range of perhaps 1,000 yards, would steady his breathing, and would give the order to fire. The torpedoes would streak through the water with that distinctive phosphorescent wake, and then silence. No explosion. The Japanese ship would alter course or signal its sister ships, and the submarine would slip deeper, frustrated and bewildered, while the torpedo that should have found its mark simply continued on into the darkness and vanished. This happened again, and again, and again. The Mark 14 torpedo had been in development for years, refined in peacetime exercises, and approved by naval engineers who had never tested it in actual combat conditions. That distinction matters deeply. What worked in a test range with carefully measured distances and ideal conditions proved catastrophically inadequate when deployed against moving targets in the chaos of genuine warfare. The first major flaw was mechanical. The torpedo's magnetic detonator, a device designed to explode when it sensed the magnetic field of a large steel ship, was far too sensitive. It would detonate prematurely, sometimes detonating from the magnetic field of the submarine itself or from the disturbance in the water created by the torpedo's own passage. The explosion would occur harmlessly nearby, and the target would steam on, untouched. But that was only the beginning of the problem. The second defect was even more troubling in its implications. The Mark 14 was designed to run at a specific depth, and the mechanism that controlled that depth, the depth-setting device, was fundamentally unreliable. Captains would set their torpedoes to run at, say, 10 feet, at the depth of a Japanese warship's hull. But the torpedo would actually run at 15 feet, or even deeper, passing harmlessly beneath the target entirely. Only later, through accumulated reports and quiet investigation, did engineers discover that the Mark 14 had never been properly tested at the depths for which it was designed. The testing had been done in shallow water, and the pressures at depth altered the mechanism's function in ways that had never been accounted for. For months, American submarine commanders operated under the weight of a terrible uncertainty. Was it their fault? Had they made a targeting error? Had they misjudged the range? The burden of doubt fell squarely on the shoulders of the men who piloted and fought these boats. Some captains began to question their own judgment, their own training. Others grew certain that the problem lay not with them but with the weapons they had been given, and that certainty itself became dangerous, because it placed them in direct conflict with the naval bureaucracy that had approved and certified the Mark 14 as combat-ready. Imagine the particular anguish of a submarine captain who had spent years mastering his craft, who had guided his boat through enemy waters with flawless tactics, only to discover that he could not trust his own weapons. A captain named Eugene Fluckey would later write of firing a full spread of torpedoes at a Japanese battleship, a target worth far more than any conventional kill, and watching as every single torpedo either detonated prematurely or passed beneath the target without detonating at all. The opportunity lost was staggering. The frustration was, one might imagine, nearly unbearable. It took months for the Navy's bureaus to acknowledge the problems. And even then, the acknowledgement came slowly, tentatively, buried in technical memoranda rather than broadcast as an urgent correction. Some captains had already begun to disable the magnetic detonators on their own initiative, taking the risk of being court-martialed for modifying their weapons in the field. They would set their torpedoes to run on contact detonators only, hoping that a direct impact would trigger an explosion. This was a crude solution to an engineered problem, but it was sometimes the only solution available to a captain who had run out of trust in the system behind him. The depth-running issue took even longer to resolve, and even when the Bureau of Ordnance finally confirmed the problem in the middle of 1942, the correction was implemented with a bureaucratic slowness that seemed almost criminal to the men in the boats. It was not until nearly a year after Pearl Harbor that fleet submarines began receiving modified torpedoes with more reliable depth mechanisms, and even then, the transition was gradual and incomplete. For all that time, all through that long and costly opening year of the Pacific War, American submarines were fighting with weapons that functioned well only by accident. What is perhaps most sobering is the question of how many enemy ships escaped destruction because of these flaws. Japanese merchant vessels that carried supplies to the scattered island garrisons, Japanese warships that might have been brought to the bottom but instead limped home for repairs. How many of these were saved by the faulty engineering of the Mark 14? The figure is impossible to calculate with any precision, but historians who have studied the patrol reports and the records suggest the loss may have been staggering. Some estimates suggest that if the Mark 14 had functioned properly from the beginning of the war, the submarine force might have achieved far more dramatic results in the first year, might have accelerated the American attrition of Japanese shipping, might have shortened the war itself. But the submarines did not have that luxury. They had to work with what they had been given, and what they had been given was broken. So they learned to compensate. They adapted. They filed careful reports that were received with skepticism. They pushed their boats deeper, maneuvered more carefully, took greater risks to close on targets, and ensure that when they finally fired, they fired with every tactical advantage they could contrive, and slowly, incrementally, with the patience that submarine service demands, the flaws were addressed and the weapons improved. But the price paid while those flaws remained was never recovered. The ships that escaped, the captains whose confidence had been shaken, the crews who had to maintain discipline and focus despite fundamental doubts about their instruments, all of these represented a cost that was borne in silence, submerged in the depths, far from the public eye or the official record. In the summer of 1942, a young submarine captain named Manat Abele commanded the USS Grunion, a Gato-class boat commissioned just months before, and there is something quietly poignant about the Grunion's story, because it would remain unsolved for longer than any submarine mystery of the war, unsolved for 74 years, until the answer came not from Navy archives or deep-sea expeditions, but from the hands of the captain's own sons, working together in the cold waters where their father had vanished so long ago. The Grunion was deployed to the far reaches of the Aleutian Islands chain, near the volcanic island of Kiska, a desolate and fog-bound corner of the Pacific, where the war had taken on a strange quality, where the Japanese maintained a small garrison and American forces were determined to deny them any foothold in what they considered American territory. Submarines in this region faced unique challenges. The waters were shallow and murky, the currents unpredictable, the visibility often measured in yards rather than miles. Radio contact between boats and command was sporadic at best, and records from these distant operations were frequently incomplete, fragmentary, or simply lost to the confusion of a war still being fought on so many fronts. The Grunion's last known position report came in late July 1942, and then silence followed. The boat simply ceased to send messages, ceased to report its location, and no one knew what had happened. Had she been depth-charged by a Japanese destroyer? Had she struck a mine in the shallow waters? Had she fallen victim to some catastrophic mechanical failure in her engines or hull? The Navy searched the records, interviewed survivors of other boats in the theatre, and found only frustration and ambiguity. Some patrol reports suggested that the Grunion had been engaged with Japanese vessels near Kiska, but the details were sketchy, the dates uncertain, the causes unclear. For decades, the Grunion remained one of the Navy's great unanswered questions, one of those losses that seemed as if it would forever hide its secrets in the deep. Families mourned without knowing exactly how their loved ones had died. The Grunion's name appeared on memorials alongside the other 51 boats lost in the war, but her own story remained incomplete, a voice crying out from beneath the water that no one could quite hear. And then, in the early years of this century, two brothers named John and Don Abele, sons of the Grunion's captain, Manat Abele, decided they could not accept the mystery any longer. They had grown up with an absence that had a face, or at least a name, and they wanted to honor their father's memory, not with vague speculation, but with facts, with proof, with the dignity of knowing. They began their own research, following threads through Navy records and historical documents, and they assembled a team of dedicated historians and oceanographers who shared their determination. In 2006, after months of meticulous planning and coordination, they launched an expedition to the waters near Kiska, equipped with advanced deep-sea submersibles and sonar technology far beyond anything that had been available in 1942 or even in the decades immediately following the war. The waters were cold and dark, as they always are in the Aleutian region, and the depth was significant, placing the wreck well beyond casual reach. Yet the search proceeded with a quiet intensity, with a sense of pilgrimage, with the understanding that they were not simply looking for a boat, but trying to restore a voice to history. And in July of that year, in the very waters where the Grunion had vanished in July of 1942, precisely 64 years earlier, they found her. The wreck lay at a depth of over 3,000 feet, on the sea floor beneath the fog-bound surface, and when the cameras of the submersible first illuminated the hull in the eternal darkness, there it was, the USS Grunion, her superstructure damaged and her conning tower crushed, bearing the marks of whatever final violence had claimed her. The discovery was both an ending and a beginning. It was an ending because, finally, after so many years of wondering, the Grunion had been found. It was a beginning because now, at last, the real work of understanding could commence. Through careful examination of the wreck, marine biologists and naval historians determined that the Grunion had likely struck a mine in the shallow waters near Kiska, an encounter that had ruptured her pressure hull and sent her sinking in circumstances that left little opportunity for escape. The mine's detonation would have been sudden and catastrophic, the kind of event that leaves no time for messages or mayday calls, only the cold facts of physics and pressure and the unforgiving sea. Perhaps 45 or 50 men were aboard at the time. The exact complement is uncertain, and none of them survived. Yet there is a quality of grace in how the story came to its resolution. Manetabele's sons did not abandon their search to some institutional memory or government archive. They made it personal. They made it a mission of love and filial duty. And in doing so, they uncovered not merely a wreck, but a testament to the power of persistence, of family bonds that stretch even across death and decades. The Grunion's captain finally came home, not in the flesh, but in memory, in history, in the knowledge that his sacrifice and the sacrifice of his crew would no longer exist in shadow. The finding of the Grunion sent a quiet wave through the submarine community and through the families of the lost. Here was proof that mysteries, even the most stubborn ones, could be solved. Here was evidence that those who had sunk beneath the waves had not been forgotten, that their stories mattered enough to warrant expeditions and technology and human determination. The Grunion would remain on the seafloor, a grave and a monument both. But now her story had joined the historical record in a way that was irrefutable, complete, and worthy of the men who had served in her. And as the darkness of the ocean had held the secret of the Grunion for so long, the depths continue to hold other secrets still, other boats and other mysteries waiting for the next generation of seekers to venture forth into the cold and listen for the voices of the boats that never came home. The USS Argonaut held a distinction that weighed upon her like the deepest ocean pressure itself. She was the largest submarine America had ever built when she first slipped beneath the surface in the early 1930s, a remarkable engineering achievement for her time, though by the standards of wartime necessity, her size would soon become a vulnerability rather than a source of pride. Her original designation had been V4, one of those experimental vessels that represented America's tentative steps into the unknown territory of modern undersea warfare, and she carried within her steel hull something of that experimental spirit, that sense of pushing beyond what had been done before. The engineers who designed her imagined that greater volume meant greater capability, more space for supplies on long-range patrols, more comfort perhaps for the men who would crew her, more weapons to bring to bear against an enemy far beneath the surface. But in the compressed reality of wartime, bigger sometimes meant slower, and slower meant more vulnerable. By the time the war in the Pacific reached its turning point in early 1943, the Argonaut had already seen considerable action, her crew hardened by months of patrols and the knowledge that every descent into darkness carried with it the possibility of not returning. She had survived the chaotic early days of the Pacific War, that period when American submarines were still learning how to fight, when doctrine was being written in real time by men who had no choice but to be both teachers and students simultaneously. Her captain, Lieutenant Commander John Rowland Pierce, was a careful tactician, a steady hand in circumstances that demanded steadiness, and he had guided the Argonaut through patrols where contact with the enemy was frequent enough to sharpen the crew's nerves and rare enough to test their patience. On the morning of January 16, 1943, the Argonaut was operating off Rabaul, that Japanese stronghold on the island of New Britain that had become a focal point for American submarine operations, a place where supply lines converged and where the enemy maintained a heavy defensive presence. The waters around Rabaul were contested territory, dangerous for submarines because the Japanese had learned by then that submarines represented a genuine threat, and they had responded by increasing their anti-submarine patrols, by deploying destroyers and escort vessels in patterns designed to protect their valuable cargo ships and their military installations. The Argonaut was seeking targets, as all submarines did, hunting for the vessels that fed the Japanese war effort, searching for that moment of advantage when the scope could rise above the water and reveal an opportunity. What came instead was an encounter with the Japanese minesweeper Koi, a relatively small vessel by naval standards, but one that was armed with depth charge capabilities and positioned in waters where the Argonaut's size became a considerable disadvantage. When the two vessels detected each other, the situation escalated with surprising speed. The Koi moved to attack, and Captain Pierce made the decision to engage rather than attempt to evade, a choice that suggested either confidence in his boat's capabilities or perhaps a belief that evasion would not be possible given the tactical situation that had developed. The Argonaut's guns came into play, those surface weapons that submarines carried for exactly this kind of encounter, and there was a brief, sharp exchange of fire on the water. But the Koi was not alone. Other escort vessels were nearby, and they converged on the Argonaut's position with the coordinated purpose that Japanese anti-submarine teams had begun to develop. When the Argonaut attempted to dive, she was slow, inevitably slow, given her size and the momentum required to submerge a hull that large. The escort vessels had already begun their run, and what followed was a depth charge attack of such intensity and duration that it would eventually overwhelm even the engineering resilience of this largest of American submarines. The explosions came in waves, each one sending shock waves through the water and into the Argonaut's hull, creating forces that stressed steel already straining under the pressure of the depths. Within the boat, the crew would have experienced a sensory cascade of terror and training, their minds focusing on the tasks in front of them, even as the physical world seemed to be fragmenting around them. The lights would have flickered and died as systems were damaged, leaving them in darkness except for emergency lighting. Water would have begun to intrude through the compromised hull, small at first and then with increasing urgency, finding its way through cracks and ruptures that no amount of preparation could have fully anticipated. The men would have moved through the boat with desperate purpose, trying to seal compartments, trying to isolate the damage, trying to buy time for the attacking vessels to move on or lose contact. But the Argonaut had been damaged beyond the point of recovery. The attacks continued, methodical and devastating, and it became clear to Captain Pierce that his boat was sinking. The decision to surface and surrender was made with the awful clarity that comes when all other options have been exhausted. The Argonaut rose to the surface one final time, not in triumph, but in desperate necessity, and her crew began the process of abandoning ship, of leaving behind not just a vessel, but a place of work and danger that had been home for months. Some of the men made it to the water, others did not. The escort vessels that had conducted the attack maintained their course, and in the chaos and violence of the moment, not all of those who left the Argonaut reached safety. The sinking of the USS Argonaut registered differently in the minds of the American submarine force than some other losses had, perhaps because she was so large, so visible in her own way, or perhaps because Captain Pierce's courage in attempting to fight, rather than simply evade, spoke to something that submariners understood about the choices they made every day, the constant calculation of risk and benefit, of aggression and survival. Her loss was also a reminder of a persistent truth that the war had been teaching since its earliest days, that larger did not always mean better, that distinctive capability could sometimes become distinctive vulnerability, and that the ocean itself remained indifferent to human ambition and human hopes for survival. The year 1943 arrived with a peculiar mixture of growing confidence and deepening peril. America's submarine fleet had learned to hunt. The early blunders, the faulty torpedoes, the hesitant tactics, the confusion of those first months had given way to something harder, sharper, more dangerous. Captains understood their boats better now. They understood the enemy's patterns, and they pushed deeper into the Western Pacific, into waters where the Japanese Navy was growing ever more desperate and ever more lethal in response. Two boats would be lost in 1943, separated by months but bound together in the archives of loss, their stories intertwined with the same hunger for aggressive action that defined the submarine war in its middle years. Their names were USS Greyback and USS Grayling, and though they bore similar appellations, their paths to the bottom of the sea followed different currents entirely. The USS Greyback, hull number 208, was a Gato-class submarine, sturdy and modern, commissioned in 1942. She had already proven herself in earlier patrols, sinking merchant vessels and warships with the methodical precision that the submarine force was perfecting. Her commanding officer was Rear Admiral John Ashley Moore, though at the time he held a lesser rank, a determined man who believed in taking calculated risks to achieve results. In February 1943, Greyback departed for her fifth war patrol. She was to operate in the waters off the eastern coast of Honshu, Japan's largest island, in an area teeming with merchant traffic and naval vessels. The patrols were growing bolder. Captains were venturing closer to Japanese-controlled ports, staying longer on station, pushing the envelope of what submarines could accomplish. And for a time, Greyback excelled. She sank several merchant ships, disrupting the flow of supplies that Japan desperately needed. But in late February, in the waters where she had been hunting, the boat simply vanished. No distress signal reached friendly ears. No survivors swam to safety. It would take years, decades in fact, before the wreck of USS Greyback was located on the ocean floor, revealing that she had been sunk by a Japanese escort vessel, one of the fast, capable destroyers that were becoming increasingly skilled at hunting submarines. The exact circumstances remain somewhat obscured by time and the fog of war. But what is clear is this: Greyback had been caught, perhaps detected by sonar or visual sighting, and brought to her final resting place by depth charges or ramming. 76 men went down with her. 76 stories ended in the cold darkness beneath the waves. But even as Greyback was taking her last dives, even as her hull was settling onto the abyssal floor, another boat bearing an achingly similar name was preparing for her own final patrol. USS Grayling, hull number 211, was also a Gato-class boat, launched just months after Greyback. She too had demonstrated her capability in earlier patrols. Her commanding officer was Commander John E. Lee, a steady hand who had successfully completed previous war patrols and was regarded as skilled and reliable. In early August 1943, Grayling departed from Brisbane, Australia, bound for patrol in the waters off the Philippines and toward the Japanese home islands. The mission was routine on the surface, though nothing about operating a submarine in the heart of enemy territory could ever truly be called routine. The patrol was to last several weeks. Grayling's crew, like the crews of all the submarines operating at that moment, understood that they were sailing into danger. They had heard the accounts of losses. They had felt the tension in the submarines that returned bearing damage, the scraped paint on the hull, the dented torpedo tubes, the holes patched with wood and prayer. And yet, they sailed anyway, because that was what submariners did. They sailed, they hunted, they carried the fight to the enemy in the most hostile environment imaginable. Submerged, blind except for sonar, dependent entirely on their commanding officer's judgment and the skill of their crew. In mid-August, Grayling sent a brief radio transmission confirming her patrol area. It was the last communication received from her. After that, silence. When Grayling failed to return to port by the expected date, she was listed as missing in action. The search that followed yielded no wreckage, no floating debris, no bodies. For decades, her fate remained uncertain. Had she been sunk by a patrol plane? Had she collided with something unseen on the surface? Had she been caught by a destroyer escort? The records were incomplete, contradictory at times, frustratingly opaque. It was not until many years later that the wreck of USS Grayling was discovered on the ocean floor, resting in waters off the Philippines. The evidence suggested that she had encountered a Japanese anti-submarine vessel, possibly a minesweeper or an escort, and had been sunk in an engagement where her attacker was never definitively identified in official Japanese records. 81 men perished with her. 81 sailors who had volunteered for one of the most dangerous assignments in the Navy. Consider the peculiar tragedy of these two losses occurring so close in time, separated by just a few months, yet following entirely different operational paths. Grayback and Grayling were not hunting the same convoy. Their captains did not know each other's fates until long after the war had ended. And yet in the grand architecture of the submarine war, their disappearances formed a pattern, part of a larger current that was claiming boats with increasing frequency as 1943 wore on. The Japanese had learned. They had begun deploying more sophisticated detection equipment. They were placing submarines in ambush positions. They were moving their patrol patterns in response to intelligence about American boats. And the American submarines, even as they were sinking more tonnage, even as their cumulative success was visibly straining Japan's ability to wage war, were being hunted with an intensity that had only been theoretical in those early months of conflict. The hunters were themselves becoming hunted. It was a dynamic that would intensify through 1943 and into 1944. The men aboard these boats, the officers in the wardroom plotting courses and maneuvers, the torpedo men carefully loading fish into the tubes, the engine room crew tending to the roaring diesel engines that powered them on the surface, the sonar operators listening intently to every whisper of sound in the water. They understood the mathematics of their situation, even if they did not always wish to articulate it. The longer you operated, the greater your chances of being discovered. The more aggressive you became, the more you ventured into dangerous waters, the more you risked everything. And yet the orders kept coming. The missions kept being assigned. The boats kept sailing out to sea. Was there a moment aboard Grayback when Captain Moore realized that the boat around him had become a trap? Did the crew of Grayling feel the pressure waves of depth charges before the final blast? Did anyone have time to think of home, of the families waiting, of the land that seemed infinitely distant when you were more than 1,000 feet below the surface, in total darkness, unable to move, unable to speak above a whisper, waiting for the sounds that would tell you whether you would surface again? These are the questions that echo in the silence of lost boats, in the memories of the men who served aboard sister submarines and understood that the sea had simply claimed another crew. The loss of Grayback and Grayling in 1943 represented not a failure of the submarine force. These boats had fought well, had sunk their targets, had conducted their patrols with competence and courage. Rather, they represented the true cost of undersea warfare, the mathematical certainty that some boats would not return. For every ship sent to the bottom, there was a price to be paid. For every successful patrol, there was a risk assumed, and for some crews, that risk crystallized into catastrophe. The names Grayback and Grayling would be inscribed on memorials. Their crews would be remembered in ceremonies where submarines would blow their horns in honor. But in the moment of their loss, there was only the cold water, the crushing pressure, the darkness, and the final silence that follows when a boat goes down. Among the boats that prowled the Pacific in those middle years of the war, none became more legendary or more feared by the Japanese than the USS Wahoo and her commanding officer, Dudley Walker Morton. The men called him Mush, a nickname that had followed him through his naval career with a kind of affectionate inevitability. He was not the type of captain who kept to regulations with unbending rigidity. Rather, Mush Morton was a hunter, relentless and instinctive, a man who seemed to sense where prey would move before it moved, who understood the ocean as if it spoke to him in a language others had not yet learned. When Wahoo was assigned to his command in January of 1942, she became something more than a submarine. She became a weapon honed to its sharpest possible edge. The Wahoo was a relatively new Gato-class boat, sleek and fast on the surface, capable of diving to depths that pushed the tolerance of her steel hull. Her crew respected Morton immediately, not because he was gentle or accommodating, but because he was clearly brilliant. Intelligent officers and experienced enlisted men recognize brilliance quickly when they encounter it. They can feel it in the way a captain positions his vessel, in the precision of his calculations, in the calm certainty of his voice when danger is imminent. Morton had all of this, and something else as well, a willingness to take calculated risks that others might shy away from, a hunger to make his boat matter in a war where so much still hung uncertain. Between January and July of 1943, Wahoo completed 6 war patrols under Morton's command. In that period, she sank more than 23 vessels, earning a reputation that preceded her into every Japanese harbor where her presence might be suspected. The Japanese Navy learned to fear the name Wahoo. They whispered it in reports and dispatches. Japanese merchants navigating the waters between their homeland and their conquered territories knew that Wahoo was out there, waiting, patient and lethal. Some of Morton's actions became legendary among the submarine force. The time he surfaced in broad daylight to machine gun a Japanese transport. The time he maneuvered his boat into a position so audacious it seemed suicidal. Yet he escaped with another confirmed kill. His crew loved him and followed him wherever he led them. In July of 1943, Morton took Wahoo northward for her 7th patrol. The waters around the Aleutian Islands had become a graveyard for American submarines. Currents were treacherous there, visibility was poor, and Japanese escort vessels patrolled constantly. The La Perouse Strait, which connects the Sea of Japan to the Pacific Ocean, separating the Japanese island of Hokkaido from the Russian island of Sakhalin, was particularly dangerous. Minefields had been laid in those waters. Depth charges echoed through the depths. Yet Morton had never shied away from danger, and he would not begin now. On the night of July 12th, Wahoo entered the La Perouse Strait. Reports suggest she was hunting a Japanese convoy that had been sighted earlier. What happened in those dark hours remains, in some respects, uncertain. Japanese records indicate that Wahoo was located and attacked, that depth charges fell upon her hull in a relentless barrage. Sonar operators in the escorting vessels heard the unmistakable cracking and groaning sounds of a submarine in its death struggle, the terrible groans that steel makes when pressure exceeds its tolerance, when rivets begin to separate, when the integrity of the hull fails. No messages were received from Wahoo, no distress signals. The boat and all 93 men aboard her simply vanished into the black water. When Wahoo did not return to Pearl Harbor, the Navy listed her as presumed lost. The details were sparse, the official reports carefully neutral. Mush Morton, who had become the living embodiment of American submarine aggression, who had personified the deadly potential of undersea warfare, was dead. His crew died with him, their bodies resting somewhere on the dark ocean floor in the bitter waters of the North Pacific. The Japanese, in their own records kept secret until after the war, confirmed that they had depth-charged an American submarine in that location on that date. Whether she had struck a mine first, whether she had been damaged in an earlier encounter, whether a mechanical failure had already begun to doom her before the escort vessels found her, these questions have echoed through the decades. What makes the loss of Wahoo particularly poignant is not merely the death of a brilliant and aggressive captain and his skilled crew. It is, rather, the sense of waste that accompanies it. By July of 1943, The American submarine force was finally, at last, beginning to turn the tide of naval warfare in the Pacific. The torpedoes were being fixed, the tactics were being refined, the boats were becoming more effective with each passing week. Mush Morton, had he lived to see the war's end, might have become one of the most decorated officers in the service. Instead, his legacy consists of what he had already accomplished, the boats he had already sunk, the reputation he had already earned. He had pushed himself and his boat to their absolute limits, and the limits, it turned out, had been just beyond where they could reach and return from. The La Perouse Strait, in the decades that followed, became one of the submarine force's most solemn memorial sites. No one can visit those waters without contemplating what lies beneath them, without thinking of Mush Morton and his crew, without recognizing that even the greatest hunters, even the most brilliant tacticians, are still vulnerable to the immense, implacable forces of the ocean. The Wahoo had been unsinkable in the imagination of her enemies, yet the ocean had sunk her. The sea does not distinguish between the aggressive and the cautious, between the famous and the forgotten. It simply continues its eternal motion, holding its secrets close, guarding the bones of those who ventured too deeply into its domain. By the middle of 1944, the submarine force had learned to live with the weapons that sometimes turned against them. The Mark 14 torpedo, for all its redesigns and corrections, remained an instrument of uncertain mercy. And yet, among all the ways a submarine could perish in those waters, the depth charge, the ramming, the collision, the slow crush of pressure at crushing depth, there was one particular death that haunted the submariners in ways they rarely spoke aloud: the circular run. The homing missile that could not tell friend from foe, that could not distinguish between the boat that launched it and the boat that sailed nearby, that could, in the smallest mathematical accident, circle back through the dark and end the vessel that gave it birth. This is what many came to believe happened to the USS Tullabee. She was a Gato-class boat, built in the yards at Mare Island, and commissioned in 1943, and by the spring of 1944, she had already established herself as an active hunter on patrol in the Caroline Islands. Her captain was Commander Charles Frederick Brindupke, a careful and methodical officer who believed in discipline and precision. The crew numbered 84 men, young boys mostly, mechanics and electricians and radio men, squeezed into a tube of welded steel that measured just over 300 feet from bow to stern. In many ways, the Tullabee was like any other boat: the hum of her diesel engines, the smell of diesel oil and battery acid, and unwashed bodies living in absolute darkness. She was a lethal machine wrapped in the ordinary routines of submarine life. On the 26th of March 1944, Tullabee was on patrol east of the Palau Islands when her sonar operators detected a contact. A large ship, it seemed, alone on the surface in open water. A target. Brindupke ordered the boat to battle stations. The crew moved with the practiced efficiency of 1,000 previous drills, each man knowing exactly where he needed to be, what he needed to do. The torpedo tubes were prepared. The firing solution was calculated. One of the Mark 14 torpedoes, loaded into the forward compartment, was armed and ready to leave the boat. What happened next exists in the realm of probability and physics, and the terrible small margins by which life and death are divided in wartime. Brindupke gave the order to fire. The torpedo left Tullabee's tube with a hiss of compressed air and a tremor that shook the entire boat. But something went wrong in that moment of release. Or perhaps something had been wrong from the beginning. A microscopic imperfection in the weapon's steering mechanism, a tiny misalignment in its gyroscope that accumulated over hundreds of yards of travel until it became catastrophic. The torpedo, instead of running straight and true toward its intended target, began to curve. It was a circular run, a malfunction that occurred perhaps one time in every several hundred firings, a statistical possibility that Tullaby's crew had hoped would never claim them. The boat waited in the darkness. In those moments immediately after firing, the crew held their breath, listening to the sonar operators counting off the range as the torpedo ran toward its target. But then something shifted in the quality of the sound. The torpedo's engine note began to change direction. It was coming back. It was circling. Some of the men who were there, or who would later recount what they understood to have happened, realized what was occurring in those final moments. The weapon they had trusted, the device designed to protect them, was now returning to them with the momentum of its own velocity and the mathematics of its own confusion. At 6:14 in the evening, a violent explosion ripped through the after compartments of the USS Tullaby. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, a roar of metal tearing and steam escaping, and the rush of seawater pouring through a hull that had been compromised. The boat went down rapidly, her stern crumpling, her internal bulkheads collapsing under the force of the blast and the incoming sea. In the darkness of the forward compartments, men scrambled, shouting instructions that could not be heard over the chaos of her dying. Within minutes, perhaps less, the Tullaby sank to the bottom of the Philippine Sea, taking all 84 of her crew with her. The thing about Tullaby's loss is that it was not immediately understood for what it was. Her sister boats received no distress signal. No one knew for certain what had happened until long after the war, when records were examined and accounts were pieced together and investigators came to the conclusion, never entirely proved but widely accepted, that she had been killed by her own weapon. Some in the submarine force found a dark symmetry in this. The very tool designed to bring death to the enemy had turned inward, a perfect circle of violence returning to its source. It was a bitter lesson embedded in the physics of submarine warfare, a reminder that in the depths, certainty was a luxury no captain could afford. There would be others. There would be more boats sunk by their own circling torpedoes before the war ended. Losses that would never be fully explained in official records. Casualties that fell into the margins between known fact and reasonable inference. But Tullaby's sinking carried a weight that persisted, because it had happened so cleanly, so completely, leaving behind no survivors to tell the story of their ship's last moments. No man to surface and speak to what had been seen in those final seconds. There was only the water and the silence and the slow certainty that down in the darkness, 84 sailors had perished, not in combat with an enemy, but in the backlash of their own instrument of war. This was the double edge of submarine combat, sharp on both sides. The weapons that made a submarine feared were the same weapons that demanded absolute respect, absolute maintenance, absolute adherence to the precise calculations of ballistics and distance and timing. One small error, one microscopic deviation, and the advantage became a liability. The hunter became the hunted. The protector became the destroyer. The crews understood this in the way that men understand risk when they have already committed themselves to it. They lived with the possibility in every patrol, every firing, every tense minute spent listening to sonar and calculating ranges, and trusting their instruments and their training, and ultimately trusting that the technology that kept them alive would not betray them in the moment when it mattered most. And yet submarines continued to patrol. The war continued, and the boats kept going down, into the darkness, carrying their crews toward fates that were sometimes clear and sometimes wrapped in mystery, sometimes the result of an enemy's skill, and sometimes, in the cruelest of ironies, the result of their own hands and the weapons they had been given. The waters around Saipan in the summer of 1944 were thick with American vessels. Destroyers and escort ships moved through the deeper channels, their crews alert to the constant threat of Japanese submarines that still hunted in those waters, even as the war's momentum had decisively shifted. The USS Seawolf, a Sargo-class submarine commissioned back in 1939, had served the Navy with distinction through nearly 5 years of war. She was one of the older boats, her hull strengthened many times over, her systems familiar to every man who crewed her. By July of that year, she had proven herself in countless patrols, her crew bonded by the intimate knowledge that comes only from living and working in the thin metal margins between life and the crushing deep. On the afternoon of October 3, 1944, and the date carries weight because it marks one of the war's cruelest ironies, the Seawolf was proceeding on the surface toward Apra Harbor in Guam, her patrol concluded, her mission accomplished. She was heading home, in a manner of speaking. The crew had earned their respite. The sea around her was calmer than it had been during the tense hours of recent operations. There was, perhaps, a sense of relief settling over the boat as she moved steadily through the open water. What the men aboard the Seawolf could not have known was that an American destroyer escort, the USS Richard M. Rowell, was operating in the same general area. The Rowell's crew, like so many American sailors in those waters, was hyper-vigilant. The threat of enemy submarines was real and ever-present. They had been trained to be cautious, to respond to any contact that might represent a danger to themselves or to the larger fleet. And on that October afternoon, as the Seawolf moved through the water with her identification systems working, with her transponder sending the proper signals, something went terribly, devastatingly wrong in the channel of communication between two American vessels. The exact sequence of events remains, even now, wrapped in the fog that sometimes obscures human tragedy. What is known is that the Rowell's sonar detected what her operators believed to be an enemy submarine. The contact was interpreted as a threat. The protocols were set in motion. There was no time for the slow back and forth of verification. There was no pause for careful consideration. The Rowell moved to attack. And what happened next was not the climax of a battle between enemies, but rather a moment of devastating human error, a split-second failure of recognition that would cost more than 100 American lives. The depth charges fell from the Rowell's racks, their explosions blossoming through the water with tremendous force. The Seawolf, caught on the surface, unable to dive in time, unable to escape the geometry of that terrible moment, took the full force of the attack. Her hull, old and patched though it was, could not withstand the violence of the explosions so close, so concentrated. She went down, not in battle against a foreign enemy, but struck down by her own countrymen in an instant of confusion and fear. The tragedy of the Seawolf lies not merely in the loss itself, but in the nature of it. There is something uniquely anguishing about a death that comes not from an enemy's hand, but from a terrible mistake, from the fracturing of a chain of communication, from the cruel randomness that sometimes governs war. The men aboard the Seawolf had survived countless patrols. They had endured depth charge attacks from actual Japanese destroyers and escort vessels. They had navigated through minefields and navigated through the dense social pressures of life in a submerged tube of steel. And in the end, they were lost not to a superior force, but to a misidentification, to a moment when someone's finger tightened on a trigger, or someone's voice gave an order, and there was no one aboard the Seawolf who could reach across that terrible distance and say, "No, we are your brothers. We are American." The wreck of the USS Seawolf would be found years later, resting on the floor of the Philippine Sea, a marker of that single, irreversible moment. The men who crewed her, the officers who commanded her, the enlisted sailors who maintained her engines, who plotted her course, who lived in the narrow steel corridors of her hull, all of them became a footnote in the longer history of American submarine losses during the war. But their story carries a weight that perhaps no other submarine loss carries, because it asks the hardest questions about the machinery of war, about the split-second decisions that govern life and death, about the fragile nature of communication, even between allies, even between friends. The loss of the Seawolf, in some ways, echoes through the silence of all the other boats that never came home. It reminds us that in the chaos of warfare, even when the larger strategic picture becomes clear, even when history can be written with confidence about who won and who lost, there remain pockets of tragedy that resist simple explanation. There remain moments where good men made decisions based on the information available to them, and those decisions, however reasonable they might have seemed in that instant, had consequences that would resonate for generations. The families of the men who died aboard the Seawolf had to carry the particular pain of knowing that their sons and husbands and fathers had survived the true enemy, had done their duty, had nearly made it home, only to be struck down by the one force they could never have anticipated or prepared for, the terrible mistake of their own side. And so the Seawolf sank into history. Another ghost boat, another name on a memorial, another reminder that beneath the official narratives of war and the confident accounts of strategy and tactics, there exist stories of loss and irony that humble us, that remind us of the fragility of every human life, even the life of a submariner who had proven his courage and his competence so many times over. In the autumn months of 1944, the waters off the coast of Formosa saw the movement of one of the most legendary submarines ever to serve the United States Navy, and her story would become one of the most singular tragedies of the entire war beneath the waves. The USS Tang, under the command of Richard O'Kane, had already established herself as a formidable hunter of enemy shipping. O'Kane was a captain of almost mythical reputation among submariners, aggressive, brilliant, relentless in his pursuit of Japanese vessels, and blessed with a kind of intuitive understanding of how to find targets in the dark vastness of the ocean. The Tang had already sunk more tonnage than most submarines would see in an entire war, and her crew moved with the confidence of men who had proven themselves again and again in the most unforgiving environment imaginable. On the 24th of October 1944, the Tang was conducting what had become a routine but exhausting patrol in the Formosa Strait, the waters between Taiwan and the Chinese mainland. O'Kane and his crew had been hunting for weeks, moving through dangerous waters where Japanese destroyers and escort vessels were known to operate, where depth charges could arrive with little warning, and where the rules of survival grew more complex with each passing hour. The crew had grown accustomed to the rhythm of submarine life, the long stretches of monotony, broken by sudden moments of acute danger, the hum of the diesel engines when running on the surface at night, the nearly silent glide when submerged and hunting. They had internalized the sounds their boat made, the way she moved through the water, the particular signature of her engines that could be detected by enemy ears at great distances. What happened on that October night would become a study in the terrible ironies of underwater warfare, in how the very weapons designed to destroy an enemy could circle back with lethal precision against their own creators. The Tang had made contact with a Japanese convoy, a cluster of enemy transports, and their protective screens. O'Kane maneuvered his boat into attack position, a process that required patience, darkness, and an almost supernatural sense of timing. The crew moved through their preparation routines with practiced efficiency, the torpedo room crew standing ready, the fire control party calculating angles and distances, the captain peering through the periscope at the ghostly shapes of enemy vessels silhouetted against the night sky. The Tang's torpedoes began their run toward the Japanese ships, their homogeneous charges of explosives and mechanism screaming through the water with single-minded purpose. One after another, the weapons found their marks. In the darkness and chaos that followed, the Japanese convoy began to scatter. Ships burned. Men cried out in the water. The Tang herself dove deeper, as protocol demanded, preparing to evade the inevitable counterattack from Japanese escort vessels. It was in those moments, when the submarine had fired her last weapons and the crew believed they had secured a significant victory, that something went terribly wrong. One of the Tang's own torpedoes, having been fired in the complex geometry of a night surface attack, had begun to circle. This was not entirely unknown in submarine warfare. The physics of the wake created by a moving submarine could sometimes cause a torpedo to veer from its intended course. The weapon moved through the water in an expanding arc, guided by the flawed systems that directed its travel, and it began to turn back toward the very boat from which it had been launched. O'Kane and his crew would have heard, through the hull of their boat, the sound that no submariner ever wanted to hear, the distinctive high-pitched whine of a torpedo approaching from an unexpected direction. The torpedo struck the Tang amidships, and the explosion that followed was catastrophic. The impact severed the submarine's hull, and water began to pour into her compartments with terrible urgency. O'Kane gave the order to surface and abandon ship, and the crew scrambled upward through the narrow passageways, climbing toward the hatch with the desperate energy of men who understood that minutes separated survival from drowning in an iron coffin sinking toward the ocean floor. The Tang rose to the surface in the darkness, mortally wounded, listing heavily as her compartments filled, and the buoyancy that had kept her alive began to fail. Men tumbled from the hatches into the warm water of the Formosa Strait, gasping and calling out to one another in the chaos of abandonment. The Tang sank beneath them, her final moments marked by the terrible sounds of her hull collapsing under the immense pressure of the deep. Behind them, as she descended, her crew watched the last lights of their boat fade into darkness. Around them, in the water, floated roughly 78 men, all that remained of the Tang's complement. They had no rafts, no inflatable boats, only their life jackets and their will to survive. The night was warm, the ocean relatively calm, but they were adrift in enemy territory, surrounded by the vessels of the Japanese Navy, whom they had just attacked. What followed was one of the most extraordinary survival stories of the Second World War. The men of the Tang, in the water and seemingly beyond any hope of rescue, began to organize themselves. They linked together in groups, supporting one another, singing quietly to keep their spirits up and to mark their presence to fellow survivors. The darkness stretched on, and they drifted in the current, waiting for a rescue that seemed impossibly unlikely. By the time dawn broke over the Formosa Strait, Japanese patrol vessels had begun to converge on their position. The survivors of the Tang were taken prisoner, pulled from the water and brought aboard enemy ships. What awaited them on those Japanese vessels was a completely different struggle, one that would last for many of them until the very end of the war. The Tang's crew, as prisoners of war, were transported throughout the Japanese Empire, moved between camps and labor details, subjected to the brutal conditions that characterized Japanese captivity during the Pacific War. Many would suffer disease, malnutrition, and harsh treatment. Some would not survive the experience. But remarkably, a significant portion of the Tang's crew did endure. They held together, drawing on the bonds forged during their months together aboard the submarine, supporting one another through the long months of captivity, maintaining discipline and hope even in the most dehumanizing circumstances. O'Kane himself became a prisoner, and like his crew, he would spend the remainder of the war in Japanese captivity, moving between camps, witnessing the slow deterioration of the Japanese military infrastructure as the war turned inexorably against their captors. The extraordinary thing about the Tang's survival was not merely that men escaped the sinking of their boat in enemy waters. That alone would have been remarkable enough. Rather, it was that so many of them, after being captured, somehow survived the ordeal of imprisonment and were finally liberated when the war ended in September of 1945. In a war that claimed the lives of roughly 3,500 American submariners, the survival of the Tang's crew represented a kind of miracle, a rare instance where disaster at sea did not result in absolute catastrophe. The circumstances of the Tang's sinking, destroyed by her own weapon, had raised a question that troubled submariners for years afterward. The torpedo malfunction that had caused the circular run was never fully explained, never given a definitive answer that would have provided closure or explanation. Some theorized that the torpedo's depth-keeping mechanism had failed, causing it to rise to a different depth and alter its course. Others suggested that the wake dynamics created by the Tang's violent maneuver during the attack had somehow confused the weapon's guidance. The truth, in all its detailed complexity, may never be entirely known. What remained clear was that the Tang, one of the most successful submarines of the entire war, had fallen victim to a weapon of her own making, a bitter irony that underscored the dangers inherent in the very tools that submariners relied upon for their survival and effectiveness. Richard O'Kane would return home after the war, eventually rising to the rank of Rear Admiral and receiving numerous commendations for his service and his leadership. He lived until 1994, well into the post-war era, able to reflect on his wartime experiences with the perspective of decades. His crew, scattered across the United States and across the world, carried their own memories of the Tang, of the night she sank, of the months that followed in captivity. They carried the knowledge that they had served aboard one of the greatest submarines ever built, that they had participated in one of the most effective campaigns of naval warfare in history, and that they had survived an experience that might easily have claimed them all. The wreck of the USS Tang lay on the bottom of the Formosa Strait for many decades, largely undisturbed, a silent monument to the risks taken by those who ventured into the undersea realm. The ocean kept her secret, kept her in the darkness where she had come to rest after that last violent moment when her own weapon found her and ended her service. The men who survived to tell the story carried with them the weight of that knowledge, the understanding that they had witnessed something catastrophic, had brushed against the boundary between life and death, and had emerged with both losses and gifts that would shape their lives forever. They had learned, in the most profound way, that warfare beneath the waves was a realm where victory and disaster could arrive in the same moment, where the greatest achievements could be followed instantly by the most terrible reversals, and where survival itself was sometimes the greatest triumph of all. By the late summer of 1944, the waters around the Philippines had become a gauntlet. The Japanese had seeded minefields along nearly every approach to their remaining strongholds, and American submarines, for all their steel and cunning, remained vulnerable to the silent threat of ordnance beneath the surface. The USS Flyer, a Gato-class boat under the command of Lieutenant Commander John D. Crowley, was among the most accomplished of her kind. She had made successful patrols, sunk enemy tonnage, and earned the confidence of her crew through the long months of the Pacific Campaign. On a warm August morning in 1944, however, the Flyer's luck ran out in a moment of navigational misfortune that would lead to one of the most remarkable survival sagas of the entire war. The Flyer was traveling submerged in the waters near Balabac Strait, that narrow passage between Borneo and the Philippine island of Palawan, when she struck a mine. There was no warning, no time for evasion. The explosion tore through her hull with violent finality, ripping open compartments and sending her into an uncontrollable descent. The damage was catastrophic and immediate. Within minutes, the Flyer was sinking beneath the surface, and the men aboard knew that their only chance lay in getting out and reaching the surface before the boat pulled them down into the abyss. 83 men fought their way through flooding compartments, scrambling upward through the narrow passages and hatches of the dying submarine, and 78 of them made it out into open water before the Flyer slipped beneath the waves. Now imagine that moment, suddenly freed from the confinement of the boat, gasping in the warm Philippine air, surrounded by the vast expanse of ocean, with your shipmates floating around you and nothing but wreckage to hold on to. Sharks are known to haunt these waters. The nearest land is many miles away, and yet 78 men had escaped. Among them were 8 who would make a decision that few submariners ever had to contemplate. They would attempt to reach land by swimming and by walking across the shallow reefs and shoals that dotted this region of the sea. 8 of them. Imagine the courage, or perhaps the resignation, that it took to undertake such a journey. The 8 survivors who separated from the main group began their desperate trek toward Palawan. The distance was not insignificant, yet the shallow waters and scattered islands offered some faint hope of reaching safety on foot rather than waiting for rescue. They waded through reefs that cut their feet, navigated passages where the water was sometimes no more than waist deep, and moved from one small island or sandbar to another. The journey was measured in days, not hours. Each step was agony. Each night brought darkness and uncertainty. The waters around them remained hostile, still patrolled by Japanese forces, and any encounter could have ended their ordeal in tragedy. But these 8 men persevered. Perhaps it was the very impossibility of their situation that gave them strength. They had survived the sinking of their submarine, clawed their way out of the flooding hull, and now they simply refused to surrender to circumstance. They rationed what little they had. They navigated by the stars and by instinct. They helped one another through exhaustion and pain. And after an ordeal that tested every limit of endurance, all 8 of them reached the safety of inhabited Palawan, where Filipino civilians, who risked their own lives to aid them, helped conceal and eventually guide them to American forces. The story of the Flyer's 8 survivors stands as a quiet testimony to something that defies easy explanation. These men had already demonstrated the courage required to serve aboard a submarine, to work in a confined space with engines that could fail, with torpedoes that could malfunction, with the constant awareness that pressure at depth could crush them in an instant if anything went wrong. They had already survived the traumatic rupture of their boat, and then they chose an additional trial. They chose to walk across hostile waters toward an uncertain destination. Not everyone could have done it. Many would not have tried. Yet these 8 men did, and they lived to tell the tale. The 17 others who survived the Flyer's sinking clung to life rafts and wreckage, awaiting rescue. They were picked up eventually, after harrowing hours or days in open water. Their ordeal ended by the arrival of a rescue vessel. The Flyer herself rested on the bottom, another name etched into the growing list of submarines that had not come home. Yet the image that endures from her loss is not one of failure, but of defiance, of 8 men who refused to accept that the sea would have them, who mustered the will to take action, and who transformed what could have been complete tragedy into a story of remarkable survival. What draws a person to take such risks, to add another trial to an already impossible situation? Perhaps it is the human instinct to act rather than to wait, to seize even the thinnest possibility of agency when everything else has been taken away. In the darkness of the war, in the cold equation of naval losses, the 8 survivors of the Flyer remind us that the outcome was never entirely predetermined, that will and effort, even in the face of overwhelming odds, could still alter the course of events, could still bring someone home. By the summer of 1945, the end was drawing visibly near. The war in Europe had already concluded. Japan's homeland trembled under the weight of relentless bombing. The great naval battles that had defined the Pacific campaign had already been fought and decided. And yet the submarines continued their patrols, continuing to hunt even as the machinery of war itself began to wind down, as if no one had quite told the boats at sea that their moment was nearly finished. It was in this strange twilight of the war that USS Bullhead slipped away from Fremantle, Australia, in early August 1945. She was a Balao-class submarine, built just 3 years earlier, one of the newer boats, strong, reliable, equipped with the latest improvements that the submarine force had learned to incorporate over 4 years of grinding undersea warfare. Her captain was Lieutenant Commander Wilfred Titus Cause, a capable officer who had earned respect among the submarine service. Her crew numbered 79 men, men who had trained together and served together, who knew their stations and their routines in that narrow, humming world below the waves. Bullhead's patrol area was the waters around Bali, in what is now Indonesia, territory that had been contested fiercely in the opening months of the Pacific War, and was now held firmly by Japanese forces retreating toward their final stronghold. It was dangerous water, shallow in places, studded with islands, filled with Japanese vessels of every type, from warships to merchant ships to coastal defense craft. But it was also the kind of hunting ground where a skilled captain could still find prey, still accomplish the mission that had carried submarines across thousands of miles of ocean since 1941. On the night of August 6th, Bullhead made radio contact with her task force commander. Everything appeared normal. Her batteries were charged. Her torpedoes were secured in their tubes. Her crew was performing their assigned duties in the warm darkness of the boat. And then, silence. Bullhead did not report in again. She did not transmit her position. She did not request assistance. She simply vanished into the waters she had been ordered to patrol, and no one on the surface would know, for many days, what had happened to her. The official record, when it finally came together, suggested what had occurred, though the exact sequence of events would remain, in some particulars, a matter of conjecture and careful reconstruction. On that same night of August 6th, American naval aircraft were conducting night operations in the area, a common practice in the war's final weeks, when air superiority was so complete that American planes operated with relative freedom even in darkness. One of those aircraft, a PV-1 Ventura patrol bomber, was navigating through the warm tropical night when it encountered what its crew identified, or believed they had identified, as an enemy vessel. What the pilots of that aircraft did not know was that Bullhead was surfaced nearby, charging her batteries as submarines did, rising up to breathe on the surface in the darkness, exposed and vulnerable as all submarines must be when they came up to recharge their electrical lifeline. In the darkness and the confusion, the aircraft crew made a choice. They had been trained to attack any vessel that could be construed as a threat. They opened fire. Bombs fell. The submarine that had survived countless depth charges and aggressive hunts suddenly found herself attacked, not by the enemy she had been sent to hunt, but by her own side, by American forces who did not realize they were striking down one of their own. The explosion was catastrophic. A Balao-class submarine, when struck by bombs or torpedoes, could not survive direct hits on her hull. Bullhead went down rapidly, catastrophically, her crew trapped inside as the cold seawater rushed through the breaches in her pressure hull. The darkness that submarines lived in every moment of their existence became, in those final seconds, absolute and eternal. 79 men died in that moment, in that sudden transition from routine patrol to obliteration. But what makes this loss particularly haunting is the timing of it. Bullhead was sunk on August 6, 1945. The atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima that same day, though word of it would not reach the fleet at sea for hours, perhaps days. Japan would surrender within a week. The war would be over. And Bullhead, the last American submarine to be lost in the Pacific War, had been destroyed not by a determined enemy making a final stand, but by an accident, by the fog of war itself, by the terrible machinery of miscommunication that somehow persists even when one side has achieved almost total dominion over the seas and skies. The loss was not officially confirmed for several weeks. Bullhead simply failed to make her scheduled reports. Her radio silence was noted. Search parties were dispatched, but in the chaos of the war's ending, with Japan's surrender creating a torrent of urgent communications and reorganizations, Bullhead's absence was simply recorded as another loss, another boat that had not come home. The peculiar cruelty of her loss, that she had been destroyed by friendly fire, and destroyed so very close to the moment when the war would end, was not fully understood or publicly acknowledged for some time. When the truth finally emerged, it struck the submarine service with particular force. Here was a reminder that submarines faced dangers from every direction, not only from the enemy they hunted, but from the chaos and uncertainty that war itself created. A captain trying to do his duty, a crew performing their routines in the darkness, pilots trying to protect their vessel from threats. All of these elements, aligned in a particular tragic moment, had combined to send Bullhead to the bottom. What strikes us now, in the quietness of reflection, is how close she came to survival. Had the timing been different by hours, had the aircraft not been in that particular place, had radio procedures been slightly different, Bullhead would almost certainly have survived the war. Her crew would have returned to their families. Her story would have been one of successful patrols in the final months of the conflict. Instead, she joined that solemn roster of 52 American submarines that never came home, the last to add her name to that list, the final boat to be lost before the guns fell silent across the Pacific. The waters off Bali that night received her into their depths without fanfare or witness. In the morning, the sea would be calm, indifferent, holding within it the secret of what had happened, until investigation and reconstruction slowly pieced together the truth, and the families of those 79 men would wait and worry and eventually learn that their loved ones had gone down not in battle, not in a heroic final stand against the enemy, but in a moment of tragic misunderstanding in the war's final hours, when the end was already visible on the horizon, when the long struggle was nearly over. When all the losses are counted, when the final patrol reports are filed away in archives and the last depth charge concussion has long since faded from memory, the numbers become almost impossible to hold in the mind without letting them slip away like water through trembling fingers. 52 submarines, not 50, not 51, 52 boats that departed from bases in the Pacific and Atlantic, that slipped beneath the waves with full crews, with hope, with purpose, and that never returned. 52 hulls resting now on the ocean floor, or scattered across trenches whose names few people remember. And within those hulls, beneath those tons of cold salt water, lay roughly 3,500 submariners, 3,500 men whose names are carved into walls of granite and marble in Pearl Harbor, San Francisco, Groton, Connecticut, whose photographs sit in frames on mantels in homes across America, whose empty chairs at dinner tables were never again occupied. It is one thing to know these numbers in the abstract. It is quite another to understand what they mean. The submarine force represented less than 2% of the American Navy during the Second World War, and yet submarines would account for nearly 60% of all Japanese ship tonnage sunk during the entire conflict. The men who served in this service knew they were volunteers in a way that the surface fleet never quite was. A sailor on a destroyer might save himself by jumping into the ocean. A man in a submarine could not. This knowledge lived with them every moment. It colored every meal eaten in a cramped galley, where the air hung thick with diesel fuel and the ghosts of 100 previous breaths. It shaped every conversation in the crew's quarters, where men slept in bunks stacked 3 high, where privacy was a concept that existed only in memory. And yet the culture of the submarine force was not one of visible mourning, not in the way the nation mourned other losses. When a battleship went down, it made headlines. The nation gathered in collective grief. But when a submarine vanished, there was often only silence. The Navy released minimal information. Families were told simply that their sons, their brothers, their husbands were missing. What had happened? Where were they? When would they return? For many families, no answers came. Not for years, not for decades. Some never came at all. This silence was part of the culture of the service itself, part of a deeper code of honor that ran through the submarine force like a current beneath the surface. Submariners did not speak widely of their fears. They did not dwell on the probability that they might not return. Instead, there was a kind of stoic brotherhood, a shared understanding that danger was the price of the work, and the work was necessary. Officers and enlisted men lived in proximity that would have been unthinkable on larger ships, where hierarchy maintained distance. In a submarine, a captain shared the same recycled air, the same constant hum of machinery, the same bone-deep vibration of diesel engines as the cook and the torpedoman and the radio man. This closeness bred a unique form of camaraderie, but it also meant that the loss of even one man was felt as a wound that never quite healed. When a submarine failed to report, when radio silence extended past the expected time, the Navy's response was methodical and measured. Search patterns were initiated. Other boats were alerted. Coastal stations kept their ears pressed to hydrophones, listening for any sign. But the ocean was vast, and sound traveled in ways that often defied prediction. A boat could have been rammed by a freighter and sunk so quickly that a distress signal was impossible. It could have struck an uncharted reef. An internal explosion could have occurred with no warning at all. Machinery failures happened in the crushing darkness, where no help could reach you, where the weight of water above was measured in thousands of tons per square inch. And the submarines kept sailing. This was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the silent services culture. Even as boats were being lost, even as captains and crews knew with reasonable certainty that some of their sister ships had disappeared, the boats continued to deploy. Men volunteered. They reported for duty. They climbed aboard these vessels knowing that they might not return, and they did so not because they were ordered to, but because there was a job to be done, and because their crewmates were depending on them. Is there a more profound form of courage than this? The kind that is never spoken of, never celebrated in its moment, the kind that lives quietly in the space between duty and mortality. The families that remained on the shore developed their own silent language of grief. They would see the telegrams arrive, and they would read the careful words about missing in action, presumed lost. Some wives never remarried. Some mothers spent the rest of their lives waiting for mail that would never arrive. In some cases, brothers would later serve in submarines themselves, following the path that their lost siblings had taken, as if there was some unfinished conversation that needed to be completed. The sacrifice became generational. It echoed through time. The Navy itself maintained certain rituals. When a boat went missing, there was a ceremony of sorts, though it was often private. A wreath might be placed. The submarine forces commanding officers would note the loss in reports that few people outside the service would ever read. But there was no public funeral, no national day of mourning. The submarine service demanded of its men a kind of anonymous heroism. Your name might appear in small print in a newspaper, listed among a crew roster. You would be known to your family, cherished and remembered there. But to the wider world, you were part of a collective sacrifice, a silent witness to the war's invisible battles. This quietness was sometimes interpreted as coldness, but it was not. It was rather a kind of reverence, a recognition that some of the most important work conducted during the war was done in places where no one could see it, in depths where light did not reach, in moments where the only witnesses were those who had already given their lives. The men who served understood this. They accepted it, and they carried with them a knowledge that most Americans, safe on the shore, could never fully grasp. That some victories are won by those whose names are never known, whose stories are never told, whose final moments are experienced only in the crushing embrace of the deep. For decades after the war ended, the Pacific Ocean held its secrets beneath miles of dark water. Families of lost submariners returned to ordinary lives, carrying questions that would never quite settle. What happened to their fathers, their brothers, their husbands in those final moments? Some boats had sent no distress signals. Some had disappeared with such completeness that the Navy could only mark them missing, presumed lost, the word presumed hanging like a thin veil over profound uncertainty. The wreckage, if it existed at all, lay in waters so deep and conditions so treacherous that reaching those grave sites seemed, for many years, an impossible dream. But the post-war decades brought a slow, patient transformation. Technology began its quiet work. Where human divers once could barely descend beyond a few hundred feet, new submersibles and remotely operated vehicles pushed deeper into the abyss. Sonar imaging grew more precise. Underwater photography became sharper, more revealing. Men and women who had not lived through the war itself became fascinated by the history their parents had endured, and they began to ask questions too. Historians pored over naval records. Researchers cross-referenced patrol reports with intelligence intercepts and depth charge logs from Japanese vessels. The archives themselves became a kind of underwater archaeology, layer upon layer of documents yielding clues that had been overlooked. In the 1970s and 1980s, the first major recovery expeditions began in earnest. Wreck hunters with genuine reverence for their subject, many of them connected to the submarine service themselves, started systematizing the search. They approached each potential site with the solemnity of men entering a tomb. When a wreck was identified, often it was by a combination of methods: the location of the last known coordinates, the pattern of sonar returns that match the distinctive shape of a hull, sometimes the recovery of artifacts that bore the submarine's name or hull number. Each discovery was a kind of conversation across time, evidence finally speaking after decades of silence. The USS Grunion's story offers a luminous example of this patient detective work. Her disappearance near Kiska in 1942 had puzzled the Navy for over 70 years. Her commander, Gunboat Crabtree, had reported sinking 2 Japanese destroyers, but then, nothing. Radio silence. The submarine simply vanished from the record. In 2006, a research team funded partly by the Crabtree family, whose sons had dedicated themselves to solving the mystery of their father's boat, finally located the wreck in the cold waters off the Aleutian Islands. The evidence suggested that Grunion had been sunk by depth charges from the very Japanese destroyers Crabtree had attacked. The boat had struck them, damaged them, perhaps believed she had sunk them, but one had turned and finished what had begun. Technology revealed what memory and documentation could not quite confirm. The sons had their answer. The boat had her truth. Similar stories unfolded across the Pacific. The USS Perch, lost in early 1942, was found years later, her hull a testament to the violence of her ending. Teams studied the wreckage for clues to her final moments. The USS Argonaut, massive even in death, revealed in sonar images and photographs the marks of the depth charge barrage that had forced her down beyond her crush depth. These were not abstract losses anymore. They became places. They became scenes. The darkness around them became less absolute when light, literal light from submersible cameras, finally reached them. The USS Tang's wreck carried its own particular tragedy. Richard O'Kane's boat, which had sunk herself with her own circling torpedo, lay on the ocean floor off Formosa. When divers later surveyed the wreck, they could see, in the twisted metal and the precise damage pattern, the evidence of that final, ironic moment when the boat's own weapon had turned home. O'Kane and many of his crew had survived to tell the story, but the Tang herself could not speak. until men with cameras descended to bear witness. Decades of research and submersible dives brought to light also what might be called the archaeology of failure. The Mark 14 torpedoes' tragic flaws, the ones that had haunted captains throughout the war, were vindicated by the wreckage itself. Captains who had felt dismissed, whose success rates had seemed inexplicably low, were proven right. The problem had never been their skill or their courage. It had been the weapon in their hands. For submarines whose losses might have remained forever ambiguous, the wreckage could sometimes point toward a cause: mechanical failure, navigational error, an encounter with an enemy patrol that had not been in the records, a mine that had been forgotten. The ocean, it seemed, remembered what the archives could not. The search also revealed something quieter and perhaps deeper. In many cases, the exact moment of sinking could never be known with absolute certainty. A submarine rests on the bottom, and the wreck tells part of the story: the damage pattern, the orientation, sometimes artifacts scattered in the debris field. But the moment of sinking itself, the final seconds when the crew knew the boat was lost, remained in a realm beyond technology's reach. That silence endured. It was, perhaps, a fitting memorial. The sea had taken the boats. It would not yield their final moments to scrutiny. What technology did provide, though, was something almost as valuable: confirmation. Names inscribed on the honor rolls could now be placed in an exact location. Families could know, with reasonable certainty, where their loved ones had fallen. The coordinates of loss became real coordinates, not abstract coordinates of memory. In this way, the slow detective work of historians and the steady advancement of underwater technology became, in essence, a long conversation between the living and the dead, across the barriers of time and depth and pressure, asking and finally beginning to answer the ancient human need: where did they go? What happened? How do we remember? The stories of these 52 boats and the men who served aboard them might have faded entirely into the archive and the fading memories of an aging generation, but something remarkable happened instead. The submarine force, perhaps more than any other branch of the Navy, made a deliberate choice not to let the silence settle permanently over the lost. In Groton, Connecticut, where the electric hum of submarine construction once filled the yards, there now stands a place of quiet reflection and careful remembrance. The Submarine Force Museum, built on land that still touches the Thames River, where so many boats first touched water, has become a shrine not just to the submarines themselves, but to the philosophy of service that runs through every hull, every crew compartment, every steel corridor where men once worked in darkness and danger. Walking through the museum is like moving through the preserved breath of the war itself. There are the periscopes through which captains once studied their targets. There are the tight bunks stacked impossibly high in the crew's quarters, reminders of how many men learned to sleep in spaces so confined that you could barely lie straight. The torpedoes rest in their cases, sleek and heavy with history. But perhaps most moving are the photographs. Wall after wall of young faces, the commanding officers and the enlisted men, some of whom would return home to build families and careers, and others whose faces remain frozen at the age they were when the boats went down. The museum does not shy away from this loss. Rather, it makes it the central conversation. Each year, on a Saturday in May that has come to be known as Lost Boats Day, the submarine community gathers in Groton for a ceremony that has no equal in the military for its depth of ritual and emotion. The current submarine force, dressed in dress uniforms, stands with historians, families, and civilians who have made the study of submarines their life's work. The names are read aloud, all 52 of them, in a slow, deliberate cadence: USS Celian, USS Shark, USS Perch, USS Grunion, USS Argonaut. on, boat after boat, name after name, until all of them have been spoken into the present, brought from the silence of the deep into the clarity of remembrance. It is a ritual so powerful that even those who have attended it many times find themselves moved anew by the weight of each name, the weight of each crew. The families have been keepers of these stories in their own right. Children and grandchildren of submariners lost in the Pacific have passed down letters, diaries, photographs, and personal accounts that might otherwise have been scattered or lost to time. Some families have traveled to undersea archaeologists, providing information that helped locate wrecks that had rested undisturbed on the ocean floor for decades. When the USS Grunion was finally found in 2007 by a deep-sea expedition, it was the sons of her commanding officer, Manut Greenert Jr., along with researchers, who pieced together the mystery of where and how their father's boat had gone down. That discovery, made so many years after the war, transformed speculation into fact, and gave to one family, and to the submarine force, a closure that had been denied for 65 years. The Navy itself has institutionalized this remembrance in ways both grand and intimate. When a new submarine is commissioned, there is often a link drawn to one of the lost boats, a kind of spiritual adoption, where the new vessel carries forward the name or the honor of the old. The tradition of reading the creed of the submarine force during ceremonies has become a way of keeping the values and the sacrifice alive in the minds of sailors who have never been to war, who may never see combat, but who inherit the weight of that history as surely as they inherit their submarines. Do you hear in that the echo of something essential, the idea that memory is not optional in a profession built on danger? The submarine veterans themselves, as they have grown older, have become living archives. The Submarine Veterans of World War II organization, formed by those who survived the war, has organized regular reunions where men who served together, who survived attacks and near misses, and the grinding pressure of patrol after patrol, come together to honor those who did not make it home. These gatherings have become smaller with each passing year, as the veterans themselves pass away. But even as the living witnesses diminish, the work of documentation intensifies. Oral histories are recorded, stored, preserved in digital archives where they can be accessed by researchers and descendants far into the future. The process of locating the wrecks, of finding the boats that never came home, has become something of a pilgrimage for certain explorers and historians. Using deep-sea sonar technology, advanced diving equipment, and painstaking research into naval records and logs, teams have located many of the lost submarines resting on the ocean floor. The USS Tang, sunk by her own circling torpedo, was found in relatively shallow water off the coast of Formosa. The USS Greyback, presumed lost to enemy action, was discovered decades later, her hulk still bearing the scars of the attack that sent her down. Each discovery is accompanied by a kind of historical completion. We finally know where they rest, can say with certainty, rather than assumption or fear, that the boat has been found. There is something deeply human in this need to know where the lost have come to rest. The ocean is vast beyond comprehension, and to lose a ship in that vastness was, in the early war years, to consign her to near total obliteration in human consciousness. The boat would be reported missing, eventually presumed lost, and then, what? The waters would close over the space where she had been, and the uncertainty would gnaw at families and the force alike. But with each wreck located, with each boat brought from the unknown into documented reality, there is a kind of peace that settles. Not peace exactly, but a resolution. A resting place finally confirmed, finally known, finally honored, not as a mystery, but as a memorial. And so the ceremonies continue, the museum stands, the names are read, the families tend the memory, and the submarines of today dive with the consciousness of those who came before. The lost boats never came home, but they have not been forgotten. In Groton, in the hearts of descendants, in the training of new submariners, in the careful documentation of historians and archivists, in the solemn reading of names once each year, the boats and the men who served aboard them are brought forward into the present. They rest now in a different kind of service, the service of remembrance, the service of keeping alive the story of what was given, what was sacrificed, and what continues to matter in the long shadow of the Second World War. The silence that once surrounded them has been thoughtfully, deliberately broken, replaced by voices speaking their names, keeping the vigil that the submarine force has always kept, beneath the surface and above it too. And so across the decades, the Pacific itself has become a living memorial. The wrecks rest in waters that continue to move, to breathe, to hold their stories in the embrace of crushing darkness and salt. The USS Grinion lies at last on the seafloor near Kiska, her hull intact after 79 years of waiting, found finally by the men who loved her most, the sons of her own captain, searching with the patience and devotion that only children can bring to their father's lost command. The Tang rests deeper still, in the East China Sea, her bow tilted in the sediment as though frozen in her final moment, and the Sea-Wolf, victim of identity mistaken in the chaos of war, holds in her compartments the memory of a tragedy born not from enemy fire, but from the fog of belonging to the same force, the same sea, the same uncertain hours of 1944. What is it, do you suppose, that draws us back to these places? What calls the descendants and the historians and the divers in their careful suits down through layers of water and time to touch the cold steel of a boat that left no survivors, that took its crew into silence? Perhaps it is the oldest human need, to witness, to acknowledge, to say the names aloud into the darkness so that they are not forgotten. Each wreck discovered, each hull explored, each log entry decoded, brings with it a kind of peace, a question answered, a face restored to history. The Submarine Force Museum in Connecticut keeps watch over the memory now, in this long peace that has held for 8 decades. Within its halls hang photographs of captains whose eyes show the weight of command, of young sailors who would never age beyond their final patrol. There are torpedoes displayed under gentle lighting, their deadly elegance somehow softened by time and glass and reverence. The periscopes stand like sentinels of a war that recedes further with each passing year, yet never fully disappears. And in the depths themselves, beneath the waves where no museum can reach, 52 boats maintain their vigil still. 52 steel monuments to courage and miscalculation, to valiant command and bitter fate, to the lottery of undersea warfare, where sometimes the best captain and the finest crew cannot outrun their own circling torpedoes, or the depth charges that rain down with mathematical inevitability. The ceremony of the lost boats never changes. Once each year, at the Submarine Force Museum's base in Groton, Connecticut, sailors and historians and families gather on a morning that holds the quality of all solemn remembrance, a certain gravity in the light, a certain quietness in the voices. They ring a bell. 52 times, the bell rings out, one for each boat that never returned. With each toll, a name is spoken. USS Sea Lion, USS Shark, USS Perch. The list becomes a litany, a prayer of sorts, a naming that transforms individual loss into collective witness. The sound of that bell travels across water and time, reaching down to the seafloor where these boats maintain their eternal patrols, where the darkness presses in from all sides and the temperature hovers near freezing, and no sound but the slow creaking of corroding metal ever disturbs the absolute silence. How strange it is to think of them now, suspended in that profound quietness. Not dead, perhaps, but not living as we live on the surface. transformed into monuments by the very circumstances of their passing. The young man who served in the engine room of the Wahoo, who kept those diesel engines running through depth-charge attacks and narrow escapes, now rests in a kind of eternal watch, his work never truly complete, never truly abandoned. The captain on the bridge of the Greyback, giving orders into the speaking tube with the absolute certainty that those orders would be obeyed, will give those same orders forever, in the endless moment of his final command. The ocean itself seems to honor them. The Pacific, vast and indifferent though it is, has become a place where private loss meets collective memory. The submarines that came home, the Gato, the Tang, the Barb, carry forever the weight of their sister ships that did not return. Every submarine captain who came after, every sailor who descended into the narrow darkness of a steel hull, carried in his chest a kind of debt to those 52 boats. It was a debt paid not in coin or ceremony, though those came in time, but in a kind of sober vigilance, a deepened respect for the forces arrayed against human will and steel and courage. The search for closure, that very human need to know what happened, where the boat went down, how it came to rest, has taken decades, and in some cases continues still. As technology advanced, as sonar grew more sophisticated, as the generation of submariners aged and began to pass away, there arose a new class of seekers, the deep ocean explorers, the dedicated historians, the sons and daughters of those who served, determined to bring their lost relatives home in the only way remaining, by locating them, documenting them, ensuring that their final resting place is known and honored. Each discovery brings a bittersweet closure, the satisfaction of knowing, mingled with the sadness of confirmation. There is a particular quality to the quiet of remembrance. It is not the quiet of forgetting, but rather the quiet of respect, held so carefully that it becomes almost tangible, a presence in itself. That quality fills the museums and the ceremonies and the conversations of old sailors who speak rarely but always with precision about the men they knew who did not come back. It fills the waters where the submarines rest, a kind of reverent watching that the sea itself seems to participate in. As this long history draws to its close, imagine, if you will, the slow dimming of the light, the way the sun touches the Pacific just before it sets, bringing all the complexity of the day into a single spectrum of gold and deep blue. Imagine the surface of the water growing still, the waves settling into a gentle rhythm, the air cooling as the warmth of day retreats. Somewhere beneath that surface, in waters ranging from 1,200 feet deep to over 3,000, the submarines maintain their rest. The USS Tang, the USS Wahoo, the Grunion, found at last. The Seawolf, victim of American hands, the Bullhead, the last to fall, and the others whose names may not linger on living lips, but whose stories are held in the clay and sediment of the seafloor, in the iron oxide that slowly reclaims their steel, in the microorganisms that colonize and consume and ultimately return them to the earth from which they came. What endures is not the boats themselves, though they persist in their slow dissolution, but the memory held in human hearts. The wives who waited for telegrams that brought the worst news, the children who never knew their fathers, the brothers and sisters who carried photographs of young men in uniform who would never age, never change, eternally suspended in their 20s or 30s, forever the age at which they slipped beneath the waves, and the submariners who came after, who descended into the darkness knowing that some did not return, and went anyway, because that is what the service required. The ocean keeps its silence as well. It offers up wrecks only when it chooses, holds tight to secrets, crushes steel as though it were paper. Yet even